the study that had musculoskeletal injury, for example, and the mRNA that they've released is actually different. So this is specific to this type of injury.
And obviously, the earlier the diagnosis, the more effective the treatment and the possibility of recovery.
Exactly. I think what is the discovery of this study is actually that those signals are present immediately after the injury. These are present from the time of injury. As soon as the player is first taken to a medical room for assessment within minutes of injury, those molecules are already there and detectable, which really makes it possible for the treatment to start immediately after the injury.
And the saliva test is pretty simple to use and inexpensive.
It's exactly like a COVID test. It's based on the same principle. All you need to do is just run a swab on the floor of the mouth for 10 seconds, and then the lab will tell you whether a concussion has occurred or not.
Professor Antonio Bello at the University of Birmingham here in the UK, and that's it from this edition of NewsHour. From me, Julian Marshall, and the rest of the team in London, goodbye.
You've been listening to the BBC on OPB, KOPB FM Portland, KOAB FM Bend, KRBM FM Pendleton, KOBK FM Baker City, KTVR FM LeGrand, KOGL FM Glen Eden Beach, KOAP FM Lakeview, KTMK FM Tillamook, KOTD FM The Dalles, KOBN FM Burns, KOPB AM Eugene, KOAC AM Corvallis, KOAC FM Astoria, KHRV FM Hood River, KETP FM Enterprise, KOJD FM John Day, and at opb.org. Coming up later today on OPB on the next Fresh Air, race, punishment, and the afterlife of mass incarceration, the subject of Reuben Jonathan Miller's new book. His father and brothers have spent time in prison, and Miller spent years in foster care. Terry Gross talks with him about his life, his family, and the sociological study of people's lives after release from prison. Stay with us for Fresh Air tonight at 7. It's 2 o'clock. The world is next.
They're counting the final votes in Israel's fourth national election in just 2 years, and the winner is...
Every elections you do have hopes that something will happen, and nothing actually happened.
Israelis are already talking about election number 5. Also today, one worldwide lesson from the pandemic: city life is easier with less traffic. But in Madrid, cyclists and walkers are fighting for their rights to safe streets.
We are in a battle to achieve more pedestrian space.
And when a London pub gets bulldozed for condos...
People used to come here, they'd use it as part of their life. And I think when that was just taken away, within a heartbeat, they were like shocked and devastated, and they wanted to do something about it.
So they did, big time. I'm Carol Hills. Those stories and more ahead on The World.
Live from NPR News, I'm Jack Spear. Vice President Kamala Harris will lead the Biden administration's diplomatic efforts to address the root causes of migration. NPR's Franco Ordonez reports on the vice president's first foreign policy initiative.
President Biden says he asked Vice President Harris to take over the administration's diplomatic push with Mexico and Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras to help them stem the flows of migration to the U.S. border.
But the vice presidents agreed, among the multiple other things that have her meeting, and I appreciate it, agreed to lead our diplomatic effort and work with those nations to accept the returnees and enhance migration enforcement at their borders.
During the Obama years, Biden played a similar role in the region. Biden has asked Congress to authorize aid for Northern Triangle countries, a total of $4 billion over 4 years. Franco Ordonez, NPR News.
The White House Coronavirus Task Force says the pace of vaccinations for COVID-19 is continuing to pick up in the U.S. NPR's Windsor Johnston reports new figures from the administration show vaccine output has more than tripled since President Biden took office.
Members of the White House Coronavirus Task Force say 70% of Americans 65 and older have received at least one shot of a vaccine for COVID-19. Dr. Rochelle Walensky, director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, says more and more people are being inoculated every day.
We are now vaccinating between 16 and 20 million people a week. And this means that we are closer to resuming activities we love to do with those we care about the most.
A growing list of states plan to expand vaccine eligibility to all adults ahead of a May 1st deadline set by President Biden. Windsor Johnston, NPR News, Washington.
The White House is promising to add to its senior staff an Asian American or Pacific Islander. As NPR's Scott Detrow explains, the move comes in response to high-profile criticism from a Democratic senator.
With increased concern about discrimination and violence against Asian Americans, Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth threatened to start voting against President Biden's nominations unless he puts forward more AAPI people for high-profile positions. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki responded with a statement affirming the Biden administration's commitment to putting together a diverse cabinet and senior staff. She said the White House will add, quote, a senior-level Asian American Pacific Islander liaison. That's led Duckworth to walk back her threat to block nominees, a threat that carried major weight since the Senate is tied 50-50. Scott Detrow, NPR News.
Orders to U.S. factories for durable goods, those are longer-lasting items like automobiles and air conditioners, took a drop in February. The Commerce Department reporting durable goods orders fell 1.1%. On Wall Street, the Dow was down 3 points. This is NPR.
This is OPB. I'm Jason Sauls. A federal bankruptcy court on Tuesday granted permission and approved money for managers of the Easter Day estate to plant wheat. Anna King has been following the case that started when Easter Day ranches allegedly invented about 200,000 head of cattle on paper.
Easter Day has two different corporate operations: ranches, the arm that allegedly build Tyson Fresh Meats for non-existent cattle, and farms, which grows feed for those cattle and other crops. The court says about 12,000 acres of Easter Day farmland shouldn't lie fallow this year. Neighbors worry the ground could become a nursery for noxious weeds and insects. The water rights for the land could be in jeopardy, the soil could erode, and farmed land is more attractive to potential buyers. Wheat isn't as profitable as corn or potatoes, but it's easier for the estate managers to grow. Spring is here, so the court wants tractors working that ground immediately. I'm Anna King.
State auditors say Oregon health officials' failure to adequately prepare for COVID-19 likely contributed to some senior care home coronavirus deaths early in the pandemic. In a report released today by the Secretary of State Oregon Audits Division, the two state agencies responsible for responding to the pandemic wasted valuable time in the first few months after Oregon's first case as they tried to figure out how to work together. The Oregonian reports more than 90 people eventually died in outbreaks that began while state agencies were building a new administrative system. About half of all COVID-19 deaths in Oregon were long-term care residents, compared to just over a third nationally. As of March 14th, 1,200 people in congregate care had died. This is OPB.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Womply, committed to helping self-employed workers and small businesses get their PPP loans. Application determines eligibility. More at womply.com/NPR.
Support for the world comes from Progressive Insurance, offering its Home Quote Explorer, so shoppers can evaluate options in buying home insurance. Custom quotes and rates available online. Learn more at progressive.com.
I'm Carol Hills. This is The World. What are the root causes that are driving tens of thousands of Central Americans to come to the U.S.-Mexico border? That's a question that White House officials are starting to tackle. Senior advisors to President Biden were in Mexico this week discussing possible solutions, but it's easier said than done. As The World's Jorge Valencia reports from Mexico City, this isn't the first time the two countries have said they'll collaborate on the matter.
Mexican Foreign Relations Minister Marcelo Ebrard gave a general outline of the meeting.
Muy buenas tardes. Para informarles de las actividades del día de hoy.
In this video, Ebrard said he met with former ambassador to Mexico and current advisor to President Biden, Roberta Jacobson.
Cómo se impulsa el desarrollo, el bienestar en esos países de Centroamérica.
The central topic, Ebrard says, was development in those countries in Central America. The countries he's referring to, by the way, are Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador.
Y lo que nos gustaría es que Estados Unidos fuese parte de este gran esfuerzo por lo que.
He says the Mexican government would like the U.S. to be further involved in projects to create more stability across the region. But the U.S. and Mexico have promised to work together on this before. And for the most part, the result has been more aggressive immigration enforcement along Mexico's southern border. That was something reported this week by David Toasura. He's with the American Friends Services Committee in the southern state of Chiapas.
El viernes lo que hay es un desfile militar en Tuxtla Gutiérrez, algo muy extraño.
Toasura says there was a military parade last Friday when the Mexican government closed its border with Guatemala. Immigration officials say they are trying to prevent the spread of the coronavirus.
El fin de semana detectamos retenes de policía estatal, de policía municipal, de la fiscalía.
Over the weekend, Toasura says, there were more police officers and soldiers stopping migrants near the border. Meanwhile, tourists continue to fly in. The state of Chiapas is popular for its thick rainforests and indigenous Mayan ruins.
Sí, hay mucho turismo y Chiapas es como el mejor contraste.
That's a clear contrast between how migrants and tourists are treated in southern Mexico, Toasura says. Many of those migrants are traveling from Honduras, and most of them leave for the same reasons, says Dora Melara, an attorney in the Honduran city of San Pedro Sula.
Bueno, yo podría decir que es seguridad, desempleo, reunificación familiar.
People usually leave, Melara says, because they're fleeing from organized crime or extreme poverty, or they want to reunite with relatives who have already left. Add to that Hurricanes Eta and Iota last fall.
Hoy por hoy, la mayoría de personas están migrando por el hecho de que perdieron todo.
These days, Melara says, most people are leaving Honduras because they lost absolutely everything in the hurricanes. So can Mexico and the U.S. come in and somehow deal with all this?
Bueno, la verdad que es una pregunta bastante compleja, ¿no? Porque
That's a tough question, isn't it? Melara says. And many people have tried to answer it, including Eduardo González Velázquez. He's a professor who studies migration at the TEC de Monterrey in the Mexican city of Guadalajara.
Yo creo que la mejor estrategia para enfrentar la migración es detenerla.
González Velázquez says the best strategy to get people to stay in their home countries includes giving them opportunities to work and access to better health care. And that's a long-term investment, he says.
Yo creo que las condiciones se podrían comenzar a construir en este momento y empezar a cosechar mejores frutos quizá en 10 años.
González Velázquez says it's a process that would take at least 10 years. For the World, I'm Jorge Valencia in Mexico City.
When you hear this next segment and start thinking, wait, I've heard this story before, it's because you have. Here's how it goes. Israeli voters went to the polls yesterday for the fourth time in 2 years. They favored Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, but didn't give Netanyahu's coalition enough votes to form a government. So Israel remains in deadlock. Rinse and repeat. But here's where the story is different this time. The emergence of a small Arab political party could tip the scales either way. I'm joined now by Mohammed Darousha. He's a political analyst in Israel and the director of the Center for a Shared Society at Givat Haviva, an NGO in Israel. Mohammed, were you surprised that the election results were so all over the place and that no side reached a majority? Or were you thinking, of course, why would it be any different?
Well, I think it was a bit surprising. Every elections you do have hopes that something will happen, and nothing actually happened. For the fourth time, we are still stuck in the stalemate, in the political stalemate, which revolves around Benjamin Netanyahu. He doesn't have a majority. He hasn't had a majority in the last 4 elections, and he doesn't have a majority now. In Israel, when you elect a president, he is dependent on sometimes 4 seats in the parliament that can tilt the balance and force new elections at any given time, and not only once every 4 years.
One detail that struck me in this week's vote was the sharp drop in voter turnout among Arab Israelis. How do you explain that?
Yes, actually, the drop in the Arab turnout went down from 64% to 49.5%. And this is due to 2 things. One, disappointment by the Arab political leadership because of their lack of effectiveness from one end, and their lack of capacity to maintain a unified Arab political party. And they also failed to deliver in the last 1 year. And actually, it's really almost impossible to expect Arab political members of the Knesset to deliver under a right-wing coalition, under Benjamin Netanyahu.
One Arab Israeli party did do well yesterday. That was the Ram Islamist party. Who are they?
Well, that's actually the Muslim Brotherhood movement. They have many political parties in many of the Arab countries, And this is pretty much their local, hard to say branch, but their local version inside Israel. And this is the first time that they dare to run independently, not joining another Arab political party. Their focus is going to be on Islamic issues, rights for the Muslim population, mainly in religious rights, but their voter base, almost 50% of it, comes from the Bedouin population in the south and the Bedouin villages in the north of Israel.
I understand that analysts in Israel say there's a possibility that the Ra'am Islamist Party might support Netanyahu to form the next government. How would that work?
Correct. Actually, they did indicate during the campaign and also now after the initial results that they do not rule out a partnership with Benjamin Netanyahu.
But how will that work, especially with extreme far-right members in Netanyahu's coalition?
Well, I doubt this will work very well. I think it's going to be a temporary type of coalition, something that will give Netanyahu breathing space for a few months, preparing for the next elections. I don't think this is going to be a lasting coalition if he is dependent on the United Arab List and the Islamic movement.
Mohammed Darausha is a political analyst in Israel and the director of the Center for a Shared Society at Givat Haviva, an NGO in Israel. Thanks a lot, Mohammed.
Thank you very much.
The military crackdown in Myanmar against pro-democracy protesters is getting more violent. One group of people that seems to be overrepresented among those being targeted are poets. Since the February 1st coup, 9 Burmese poets have been detained, 2 more have been killed. My colleague Marco Werman spoke with Christopher Merrill about this. Merrill directs the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. He's led several cultural diplomacy missions to Myanmar over the years and says poets, along with writers and journalists, all seem to be on some kind of target list. Here's Marco.
So the 2 poets who were killed during protests on March 3rd in Myanmar, who were they?
One was the poet Myint Zin. She was viewed as a popular teacher and poet, and then Keza Win, who remarkably made almost what looks like a clairvoyant prediction that he might lose his life. Myint Zin even wrote down her blood type and identifying features on her arms, knowing that there was a decent chance that their protests would be met with violence.
Do you have a sense of reaction from the Myanmar community globally about the deaths of these 2 writers?
Just pure horror from everything that I can see. As one poet said to me regarding another poet who's now in jail, if he gets out, we'll all get out. We'll all be free. If he stays in, we'll all go in. That is to say, they will all be arrested.
I know you've met with poets and writers in Myanmar, Chris. The first time was in 2004 when the country was firmly under military rule. What was the situation like for poets and writers in 2004?
Well, that was a time, as they used to say, of the Soviet Union when everybody spoke in whispers. I met one very courageous writer who had spent 6 years in solitary confinement for her writings and the fact that she was close to, at the time, Aung San Suu Kyi, who was under house arrest. She told me that in prison, she and her fellow writers and poets described books as vitamins, and that her notion was that the human soul cannot live without the vitamins that are provided by poetry. I remember meeting another poet who would publish his books in samizdat editions, that is, pasted together and handed from poet to poet, in editions of less than 10. Anything more than that risked him losing his life.
Wow. So you returned to Myanmar in 2013, leading a literary delegation. What was different in 2013?
The difference was night and day. Many poets turning out for every event that we put together. We met at the university. There was big talk about a new English literature curriculum. And mind you, before that in 2004, the universities were open only 2 days a year, once for commencement and once for graduation, because the military regime feared what might happen if students congregated together. That is to say, they would protest against military rule.
Chris, you've got a personal connection to one of the poets who is now in prison in Myanmar. His name is Maung Yu Ki. How do you know him?
Mong UP was a resident in the International Writing Program in 2015. At the time, we viewed him as an extraordinarily talented young poet. He is just turning 40 this year, having published about 3 books by that time. Since then, he's been rounded up and detained, and the rumor has been that he will be handed down a 2-year prison sentence simply for being a poet who went to the protests.
You said Mong Yupi was a really promising writer at the International Writers Program in Iowa. Do you have a poem or a stanza by Mong Yupi that you can share with us?
I do, and it's a beautiful poem translated by Koko Thet, who is a Burmese poet living in exile. This is called Under the Great Ice Sheet. Under the great ice sheet, a great country has been buried alive. Under the great country, a great church where God no longer shelters. Under the great church, the great wars welded together 6 feet under. Under the great wars, a great museum of culture, dilapidated and yellowing. Under the great museum, banknotes without currency. Under the banknotes, slaves with protruding bones and sunken eyes. Under the slavery, a Stone Age pulse sealed by stones. Under the Stone Age, regressive evolution. Under the evolution, the ocean, the mother of Mother Earth who died in labor. Under the ocean, a great ice sheet, unanticipated. Under the great ice sheet.
All members of the council are attending remotely by
Christopher Merrill is a poet and writer himself. His memoir is Self-Portrait with Dogwood. He's also director of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa, speaking with us about the poets in Myanmar killed and detained by the military junta there since the coup in February. Chris, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Marco.
The public can also provide written testimony to the council clerk at cctestimony@portlandoregon.gov. The council is taking these steps as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to limit in-person contact and to promote physical distancing. The pandemic is an emergency that threatens the public health, safety, and welfare, which requires us to meet remotely by electronic communications. Thank you for your continued flexibility, your patience, your understanding as we navigate these challenges to conduct the city's business. With that, we'll hear from legal counsel on the rules of order and decorum. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mayor. Because we are not taking testimony today, I think we can dispense with reading how people should testify, but that's up to you.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a plan. We'll get 2 minutes of our life back. And with that, Keelan, we have 2 items on our afternoon agenda, items number 183 and 184. If you could read them together, please.
183, amend Title 33 Planning and Zoning to facilitate the provision of shelter and housing options for Portlanders in need. And 184, amend City Code Health and Sanitation, Emergency Code, Public Improvements, Water, Property Maintenance Regulations, and Affordable Housing to facilitate the provision of shelter and housing options for Portlanders in need.
Thank you. Colleagues, this item, of course, is a continuation of the Shelter to Housing Continuum Project deliberations. Last week, we heard several hours of testimony, and we've received over 2,000 submissions so far in terms of written testimony. I want to thank my colleagues for sticking around for quite a while on the 17th to hear from everybody. And I particularly want to thank the public, everybody who participated in that meeting, many who waited hours to have the opportunity to testify. We really appreciate your feedback. Today, we're going to discuss what we heard in that testimony. We're going to have the opportunity to ask staff questions. We would also like to take this opportunity today to at least informally identify amendments that we'd like to be proposing. We don't need to make motions today, and we don't need to vote today. In fact, we're not going to vote today. But I would like us to give staff direction so that they can have an orderly set of votes for our time certain next week. So it's important that today we give them direction in terms, and as specifically as possible, about the types of amendments that we would like to see them bring forward. Daylighting potential amendments today will also give the public the opportunity to comment, since the written record is still open at this time. Before I ask all of you and me as well to reflect on the testimony we heard, I'd ask that the Bureau staff provide us with a summary of the testimony as they understood it up to this point. And I see Eric Engstrom is here and Joe Zender from the BPS staff. Why don't you go ahead and jump in, unless any of my colleagues have anything they'd like to say right up front. Good. All right, gentlemen, take it away.
Joe, do you want to kick it off? Joe is muted, so I'll get started. As you mentioned, Mayor, and this is Eric Engstrom with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. As you mentioned, we've received over 2,000 written comments so far on the app that folks can use to submit comments. I will just briefly talk about what we're seeing in that testimony and encourage all of your staff to go through that. Also, just a reminder that in the panelists list, we have a number of staff from our partner bureaus that help assemble this package, including BDS, Parks, Housing, the Joint Office, BES, and others. And so as we're going through this, I'll do my best to try and pull them in where there's technical issues that they can help with. But by all means, if you also have specific questions for specific bureaus, feel free to ask and we can get the right person to answer it. So overall, the testimony, as you probably know, the overwhelming number of comments are about not using parks, trails, or open space for shelter. Also heard a lot about natural areas and concern about the impact of camping and shelter in natural areas. We mentioned this last time, but there's continues to be general confusion between, understanding the difference between sanctioned facilities and just informal camping that people see around town. And so we'll want to continue to be clear about that this package is really about managed public facilities, not where individuals or informal groups are allowed to camp. Trash collection and cleanup concern was mentioned. Some concerns about crime were mentioned. There is some opposition to outdoor shelters generally, I think coming from a perspective of preferring permanent housing as the solution. We also heard some, not a lot, but some opposition to community centers being used as temporary shelter. Some requests to more tightly regulate shelter operators. There also are some parks specific fears. In particular, the folks who live around Gabriel Park and Mount Scott are concerned that their particular parks will be part of this. And as far as I know, there are not any specific plans at either of those parks for outdoor camps, but that rumor seems to be spreading. We heard some support in the testimony for the Portland Neighbors Welcome amendment requests. There was a letter in the testimony that I believe you've received that had a couple amendment requests from them, and some people have expressed support for those. A number of general letters of support from faith-based organizations. Neighborhoods, in particular, East Portland neighborhoods have expressed concerns about geographic balance, notice separation between shelters, and there have been some requests to exclude East Portland neighborhoods from shelter siting. Some opposition to single room occupancy dwellings and RVs and tiny houses on wheels being used for housing. Some support also for tiny houses on wheels. There have been some requests for multiple tiny houses on wheels, more of a village model for housing, and this is distinct from the shelter option that we've provided in the package. And then there's some discussion in the testimony about either support or opposition to the sewer mandate for the tiny houses and RVs. So that's again, the overwhelming number of letters relates to the parks and natural areas topics. Earlier in the process, before the Planning Commission held their hearings, we heard many of these same concerns. In particular, At that stage of the process, we also had heard some concern about parks and natural areas and open space zones. We, at that time, were receiving a lot of strong support for the RV and tiny house options early in the testimony. And then we had some support in early in the testimony for many of the group living aspects of the package, although later testimony is not focused on that nearly as much. So that's a whirlwind tour of the testimony, and again, I hope you all have time to look through it in more detail, and I'm happy to answer questions about it to the extent I can.
Thank you, Eric. And Joe, did you have more to add to?
Just real quickly, Mayor, we really appreciate the time that your offices gave to staff on this last week to work through the issues and questions that came up with testimony, and it's going to serve your discussion today well, because it allowed us to get organized and sort of focus in on issues and positions. One other timing related issue is that one of the last steps that we as staff have to take after you vote on amendments at your next meeting is to update the state required findings so they reflect that final code package. And one of the quality assurance step that's important for us to take is to be able to take the time to update those findings so that we're better able to respond to any appeals that get filed with the state on your final code package so it can go into effect. So that's all I have to add, and thank you.
Great. So here's colleagues what I would propose we do. I would propose that we give a little bit of space here for the city council to be able to express what we heard and what some of our initial thoughts are. Then I'm going to ask staff to take us through the various broad sections of the proposed ordinances, starting with the general questions relating to sheltering, then get to the questions around parks and open spaces and trails and the like. And we'll have time to chime in and ask more specific questions in each of those areas. And that will be a staff facilitated discussion, but I'd like to leave some space right now for the council to reflect on what we heard during that testimony. And I'll let whoever wants to jump in first. And if not, I'll jump in first. I'm happy to do that too. I'll go ahead and go.
Mayor, I can't find my hands up button. I don't have any help.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for some reason it's not reflected on our screen.
Go to, do you not have the participant list down at the bottom?
I have the participant
list. Click on that and then you'll get there's a raised hand that'll show up on the margin underneath the list. Try that.
No, not there either.
Well, that's okay. I've got it. I'm sorry you don't. Commissioner Hardesty, today we'll just be informal about it. You want to jump in first?
I'm happy to jump in. First, I want to just really appreciate the incredible work done by BPS to bring this forward. Anytime we're talking about changing land use, you know, it creates a lot of fear and anxiety among people. And I just want to really appreciate Joe and Eric's continuously excellent work to really lay out what the choices are that we as the council face. And for my newer colleagues, let me just say that you missed the opportunity to be part of the council when the residential infill project was here, and that was a multi-year, I believe up to 5-year project that finally made its way through the city council. I want to also say I appreciate I appreciate all the community testimony, but what I especially appreciated was the compassion and empathy that most people used, and understanding that we are in a crisis of a magnitude that we have not seen before, and that could get a whole lot worse before it actually gets better. I also share the concern that was raised over and over again around lifting of the eviction moratorium. I think we as a council have to do everything we can to keep people in the homes they have now, notwithstanding understanding that mortgages and rent must be paid at some point. I hope that we as a council will continue to center the folks who are most impacted by these decisions. Having said that, I think there's a misperception about how parks and open spaces would be utilized under this proposal. I don't think we did an effective job of explaining to the public that what we're talking about are self-managed operations that would have limited number of campers and would also have access to a laundry pickup, I mean, not laundry pickup, but garbage pickup and other necessities to make it operate like most of the self-managed camps that operate today in the city of Portland. I also want to remind the public that self-managed camps are the safest outdoor opportunities that our community members that are living outside have because they manage the behavior of the people who are inside that camp. And we've heard testimony like that from a whole host of communities that live around self-managed camps. I personally do not have any amendments that I plan to put forward, but I am very interested in what the council, how the council will act on the eviction moratorium and whether or not that is something that we should have at the ready in case the state and the county refuses to act. Because I am very concerned about what would happen there. Otherwise, I will just say that I am in support basically of what has been presented to me, and I look forward to hearing from my other colleagues about if they have any amendments that I should consider. But I am pretty happy with what we've been presented with so far and don't have any real problems with it.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Commissioner Rubio, I think I saw your hand go up there.
Thank you, Mayor. And at the outset, I indicated before that I wanted to create space where we could have more discussion about the shelter to housing and hear from the community. And so my hope was that continued community input would help us all to clarify the dimensions of the proposal and help us reach its best possible form. And I'm really pleased that that's happened. Last Wednesday was obviously a long day for all of us, for community, council members, testifiers, and staff, but it really did help me clarify some of my thinking around the proposal and deepen my knowledge as well, particularly hearing from folks with lived experience and things that I hadn't considered. So I just hope that as we continue to move forward with shelter housing and with other big policies moving forward, like economic recovery, community safety, climate change, and air quality, that we really allow ourselves the time and space to authentically center community in our approach, to collaborate with one another and to get these policies right. We'll always have timely or urgent decisions to make. That's the nature of this job and this role. And in this case, the expiring emergency, or maybe we're acting really quickly in response to something that has just happened. But I really hope that we can continue to work together and collaborate regardless of our bureau assignments so that we're not limiting our long-term work and we're moving the work forward together. That is rightly what the community expects from us. So I'm really appreciative about the thoughtful way that we've all done that in this instance. And I'm also very glad we took the time to create more space for community to share their perspectives and hope that we can replicate this process in the future. Lastly, I'd just like to echo what my colleagues have said and give tremendous appreciation to the thoughtful work of planning and sustainability commissioners, as well as the great and careful and complex work of Eric Enstrom and Joe Zender and the team at BPS to bring us to this point today. That was a significant undertaking, and I want to appreciate that we are just seeing the end result of years of work, and we're so appreciative. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Anybody else? Commissioner Maps, I see your hand raised.
Yes, I apologize. My hands up button has disappeared this afternoon.
That's all right. I can see you all just fine. That works.
I'm jealous of Commissioner Ryan, who has his hand icon. I must have gotten on the naughty list or something. Like my colleagues, I want to express my appreciation to staff who put together this really visionary proposal for how we can go about serving our houseless community more effectively. I also want to thank the more than 100 Portlanders who turned out to testify. I appreciate your humanity, your vision, and your commitment to our city. Like Commissioner Hardesty and the mayor, I also want to remind the public that I think there has been some misunderstanding about the scopes of this proposal, especially around camping in public or open spaces, specifically in parks. At least in my reading of what was before us, that was never what was on the table. And it's not something that I would support, frankly, although I think there's some situations where we might use our public spaces or open spaces to house the homeless. And there's some minor amendments that I plan to advance today. But the big proposal that I want my colleagues to consider and staff to consider is to break out the discussion surrounding RVs and tiny homes. I think this is an incredibly important issue, which frankly has been overwhelmed with public concern about camping in open spaces. So I would suggest to council that at some point we break that off, break the tiny houses on wheels issue and the RV issue out, and we have a separate work session on that. My main concern here is that we effectively balance the need to provide people with alternative shelters. At the same time, we protect the environment.
Excellent, thank you. Commissioner Ryan.
Yes, good afternoon. Just a few things, because I look forward to diving into the work like the rest of you. First, I'm a little giddy right now, just have to say it. The University of Oregon women and men are in the Sweet 16 in March Madness, so hence the sweater. Okay, got that out. I'm also want to say that the testimony last week, in my opinion, so far since I've been on the council, was the most, and it was mentioned earlier, it was just so thoughtful. And you could tell people that testified were speaking their truth, and it was very refreshing. It was a long session, but it was worth every testimony. And I just want to thank all of it's great to live in a city that is so engaged in the well-being of the entire city. And you really, if anyone tuned in last Wednesday or last Thursday, when was that? Last Wednesday afternoon? Yeah, it was a really, I love Portland moment. And I thought the staff just did an amazing summary of what we listened to, and I appreciate that synthesis. And Commissioner Hardesty, I'm glad you brought up the eviction moratorium. I want you to know that Director Callahan and I are talking about this, but more importantly, we're taking action. So it won't be an emergency conversation in June. But I appreciate you bringing it up. I just want you to know that the mayor asked me about this a while ago. And so Director Callahan and Director Jolin and I are in frequent conversations, and we'll be coming back to you within the next month with some update on how that's going. So, but thanks for bringing that up. And I'm sorry I failed to mention that until now. Anyway, looking forward, we have a lot to do, so I will be brief, and let's do this.
Very good, thank you. And I think I am last, if I'm not mistaken. We got everybody else correct? Good. So first of all, I want to acknowledge and thank the public. This is a theme all of us have mentioned, and I definitely agree. It's fantastic to have that public input. We appreciate it. It gives us an opportunity to better understand the issues that are in a proposed ordinance, and also understand where it needs to be strengthened. And I heard a lot during public testimony last week. I took extensive notes. I heard a number of themes that we're going to be discussing today as we're considering amendments on what we heard. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge what a couple of you have acknowledged, which is that overwhelmingly, regardless of whether people were very supportive or not supportive, what I heard people say uniformly was that they do have concern and compassion and empathy for people who are living on our streets. And they're looking to us, the city council, to be humane as well as effective in our approach to address that crisis. So I want to call that out first, that there was an overwhelming theme of compassion for people who are living on the streets. Second of all, it goes without saying that the biggest concern that was raised was around the question of shelters and camping in parks, on trails, and in natural areas. And while I agree with much of the concerns that people expressed, I actually would like to say I don't think some of those concerns are necessarily well-founded based on the language, but I think there are also opportunities where we could strengthen and clarify the language, I think that in and of itself would address a lot of the concerns that we heard. I certainly heard about the desire for shelters to be equitably distributed throughout the city. I also heard resounding support for the city's continued efforts to provide safety and stability to people who are currently experiencing homelessness. And I heard a lot of people talking about their support for us working towards solutions and providing shelter to people who live outside. So not directly related to this particular set of ordinances, but completely relevant. The package of code changes that we're considering codifies what we've learned since the beginning, the very beginning of the state of emergency. It recognizes the importance of having the option to create shelter in many different areas across the city to meet the needs that exist in those areas. These code changes are important, I believe, and a necessary step towards ensuring that we can have a highly effective, diversified, and geographically based emergency shelter system for people who are experiencing homelessness in our community. Now, with the remaining time we have today, we will work to identify the amendments that should be put on the table next week. We have bureau staff obviously available from multiple bureaus to answer any questions and better inform our decisions. As a reminder, we're not going to make formal motions during this meeting. We're going to give staff the opportunity to draft and come back with thoughtful amendments for motions. I believe that the first area that we wish to discuss pertains to the code that deals with group living. The recommendation on the table is to remove the definition of household from the zoning code and expand where group living uses may be located without a conditional use permit. There wasn't a large amount of testimony about this particular element of the project, but staff does have some technical amendments based on what I thought were some incredibly informed, some very informed testimony that was given by a number of people. And so I'll call on Eric et al. To walk us through some of those proposed ideas.
Thank you, Mayor. As you mentioned, we have a couple technical suggestions related to this section. We didn't get a lot of testimony on it, but I want to thank my colleagues at BDS who always spend a good deal of time looking through draft language and sometimes catch glitches that are very helpful as we move to council. And so a couple of these came from analysis from the Bureau of Development Services, so thank you to those staff. Whenever we change definitions that are spread throughout the code, there are some unanticipated consequences. And one of the impacts of the way we reorganized the group living section of the code was that we left some ambiguity for certain kinds of group living structures in terms of what the development standards would be that apply to those structures. And specifically, I'm talking about congregate structures, which are group living structures that don't meet the definition of a dwelling unit, either because they don't have all the ingredients of a dwelling unit, or maybe because there's just a very large number of bedrooms relative to kitchens. And three standards were left a little bit unclear in our recommended draft. One related to what the mass and bulk of the buildings would be allowed to be, in other words, floor area ratio. Another related to outdoor area requirements. For traditional residential development in multifamily and mixed use context, we have an outdoor area requirement that encourages either balconies or shared outdoor space so that residents have some access to the outdoors. And we had that requirement for group living as well, but we left a few of the connections, the connective tissue in the code unclear. And so fixing that is another element. And then finally, related to parking, we want to make sure it's clear what parking requirements apply to group living situations, particularly congregate structures. And for those of you who are around during the residential infill project, you might remember that as part of that project, you removed the off-street parking requirements for single dwelling homes. And when we reorganized the group living section, we left group living uses that would be allowed in single dwelling zones with dramatically more parking requirement inadvertently. And so we're trying to make sure that that playing field is somewhat level and that there's a similarity there. So this amendment would change the parking standards to sort of create that same situation for small group living uses that don't require conditional use in single dwelling zones. And with your permission, I'll share a screen just briefly to show you those amendments, if that makes sense.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
And Eric, based on what you've told us so far, these sound like they're largely technical amendments, or am I incorrect on that?
That is correct, but we always want to be, transparent about what they are.
All right, I'm just trying to get my hands around it.
So the first one is related to congregate, and you should be able to see my Word document on the screen right now. Congregate housing facilities in single dwelling zones, and it's just inserting language that explains what that is. And by the way, the convention in all the documents I'm going to be sharing today is that the highlighted text will be the thing that's being changed, because the document already has strike through and underline that reflects the underlying amendments that are being made. And so when we're amending the amendments, so to speak, we use the convention of the highlighter to show the part that's changing. And I'll try and be as clear as possible about that. So we're changing some text, and then there's a footnote in the table that talks about floor area and where to go to find the standards for that. So we're adding a footnote at the bottom here that says including any site with congregate housing facility. We're giving it the same floor area as a single dwelling unit in that situation. So that's the first item that I mentioned. The second one here is the outdoor area requirements. Here we're changing the language to be more generic, to say on a site with a residential use. And then we're adding a reference to sites with a congregate housing facility so that that's clear. And then making sure that the specific standard is cited. And this is something that was lost in the shuffle when we eliminated the former group living chapter of the code, that standard went away inadvertently, and so we're restoring it here. So that's the second element, dealing with outdoor area. The third is, as I mentioned, the parking requirement, and that's changing something in chapter 266, which is the zoning code parking chapter. And so basically we're adding a section here that is for group living, and it's basically saying that it's not required if it doesn't require a conditional use, and that would be for the small group living facilities that are under 3,500 square feet, that under this package would no longer require conditional use review. And so that gives them the same footing as the essentially a single dwelling situation. And then also changing the actual table to refer to bedrooms rather than residents, which is consistent with the provision in the way we're reframing all of the group living situations to not be addressing sort of the people relationship element, but dealing more with bedrooms as the currency of density. So those are the three clarifications around development standards. There is one other technical change here that BDS is requesting, which when we eliminated the definition of household, we may have caused them a little bit more difficulty enforcing the accessory short-term rental regulations, because that regulation refers to households in terms of how many people could be in a structure. And so the current practice is that a household can include up to 5 unrelated individuals. And so in this particular short-term regulation, what we're saying is we had already deleted the reference to the household, but we're adding the number 5 there so that they have a reference point to how many people are allowed to be in the short-term rental in that situation. Otherwise, there's not any sort of hook for them to be enforcing the volume of that use.
So, Mayor, if I may.
Yeah, jump in.
Eric, I'm curious as to if this would if making this change would have an impact on the Airbnb market, and if so, I'm always worried about when we change policy, like what are the unintended consequences, and just really curious if this would, in fact, create some loopholes for Airbnb that do not exist today.
I think it's actually keeping us from opening new loopholes, I think is the way I would characterize this. The current enforcement, they are in effect using the number 5 already, because that's by definition the number of unrelated people that can be in a structure, and the current regulations refer to the household definition. This is also addressing a type A short-term rental. So these are the smaller ones that require less process. The larger sort of the larger situations that still require conditional use are not affected by this limitation, is my understanding. And I don't know if any of my BDS colleagues who are on the call, if you have anything else to add on that question, either Matt or Kristen, if you're on the call, if you have any further thoughts.
If you're not worried, Eric, I'm not worried, but I just thought I would mention it for the public record.
Yeah, I think this is essentially keeping the status quo through different language, since we removed the household definition, which got us there before.
Thank you.
So those are the elements related to household living, and as I mentioned, those are all fairly technical and minor. There was not, as far as I'm aware, we have not received any requests from any of your offices for larger policy amendments to this section.
Okay, very good. And I also want to just reiterate that the public record is still open. So if there's people listening to this who are hearing things and following along in the code and want to make recommendations to us, that is still very much appropriate and appreciated. So it sounds like you have heads up then, unless I'm misreading anything. It will say heads up, thumbs up on that, to go ahead and draft specific amendment language for those technical amendments that you brought forth.
Thank you, Mayor. And I guess I'll mention too, just across the board with all of this, is that I'm sharing language that's preliminary, and what we'll be going back and making sure that this is in fact the language we want to use. But in most cases, I'm sharing actual language today, but it is tentative still.
All right, that's good, and I appreciate it. So we'll wrap up that section. We'll now transition to a meatier topic, which is discussing amendments related to sheltering in Title 33. And I anticipate a lot of the discussion here is around amendments related to open space and natural areas and definitions of outdoor shelter, and some technical amendments. And so I would suggest to our team that we begin with what I think everybody's most interested in discussing, and that's open space and natural areas. So why don't I go ahead and kick us off. Before I turn it over to Commissioner Rubio, and I think Commissioner Ryan also has some insight into this, I'd like to provide a point of clarification of what the project does and does not do when it pertains to open space zones. I think there was some confusion on this subject last week. In the recommended draft that we have before us, permanent shelter is prohibited from open space zones. Temporary shelter is allowed, but only under very specific conditions. That is, number one, during a declared state of emergency, and number two, for a limited number of days during a calendar year. Areas zoned open space include natural areas, but they also include developed infrastructure, such as buildings and parking lots that can be appropriate and suitable places for shelter on a temporary basis. The homeless crisis that we're in right now, for example, challenges us as a community with how we grapple with multiple priorities simultaneously. As a council, we're tasked with determining how to leverage the city's limited resources to serve everyone in our community, both housed and unhoused, while preserving our important natural areas that make Portland such a special place to live and call home. And I think we heard a lot of that expressed during the public testimony last week. So I want to reiterate, this project is not about legalizing unsanctioned camping. And the code, again, states quite clearly that permanent shelter is prohibited from open space zones. So what we are doing here is we're trying to remove barriers to building more managed programs run by public agencies and qualified nonprofit partners that can achieve positive outcomes on both of these priorities. As an example of the partnerships that can be done, I just want to point to our partner Do Good Multnomah, which is a homeless services nonprofit that focuses specifically on veterans. They ran a winter shelter in the Charles Jordan Community Center this winter. And I want to thank them, and I want to thank the Parks Bureau leadership for their use of that space. I think that was an effective and smart use of space during the crisis. And we were able to keep hundreds of people safe and warm this winter because of the use of that facility. And so I just want us to keep in mind here, we're not talking about a wholesale departure from what we're currently doing today. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Rubio, who led the work on drafting amendments related to open space and natural areas for us to consider. Commissioner Rubio.
Thank you, Mayor. And I also want to thank everyone again who testified last week about shelters and open space zones, and to the many, many others who submitted written comments and contacted our offices. My staff and I have had ongoing conversations with Commissioner Ryan's office, with the Joint Office of Homelessness Services, the CPS, Parks, and other council offices about shelters in open space zones. And for those who might be watching, I also want to reiterate what the mayor said, that open space zone is a term from the city's zoning code, and it includes several different kinds of properties besides parks and natural resource areas. And that came through in the testimony as well. During this section, I'll provide a high-level overview of amendment ideas that have been discussed since our March 17th hearing. And after I've gone over all of the options, I'll turn it over to staff who will provide additional information and answer questions. Then we can move forward from there. So first, there seems to be agreement among council offices that there is not intent, and there never was the intent to put temporary outdoor shelters in parks and natural areas. Council recognizes and agrees that this intent was not as clearly reflected in the policy as it should be, and we need to clarify it through amendments. Therefore, we would add amendments that state temporary outdoor shelters aren't included when we talk about open space zones nor natural area overlays in all zones, not just open space. What we also want to be clear about is this, that council will continue to have the ability to activate all open space zones in the case of emergency. This will be retained and stay intact because when emergencies hit us, it is our responsibility to consider all available options. And this is what we currently have in place and will not be removed, but stay intact. The mayor has also expressed an interest in allowing temporary shelters in paved parking lots and open space zones. And this could mean parking lots at parks, community centers, and golf courses. And if we move forward with an amendment for this allowance, there will be some accessibility needs for parks patrons and other folks that need assistance that we will need to accommodate and figure out. But this could move forward. There are also other public parking lot options not in open space zones, and we're really open to the conversation about parking lots. Last week, we heard testimony about underdeveloped or underutilized properties that are not parks and natural areas that could be candidates for permanent outdoor shelters as well. This sparked really good conversations, and council offices have discussed the possibility of directing all city bureaus to examine surplus city property for suitability and for transitional shelter accommodations and affordable housing. This wouldn't necessarily be a code change, but it would be a directive to all city bureaus. The shelter to housing continuum policy includes a provision to allow temporary shelters in community centers without having to declare an emergency. And this would give the Joint Office the flexibility and efficiency that they need to activate these sites without having to go through a lengthy council process. For example, there might be a weather event that or weather events that aren't to the level of an emergency, but the conditions still warrant an effort to bring people indoors. And we're not proposing an amendment here because we need this flexibility, but I wanted to call this out as well. So now I'll pass it over to Eric from BPS to go into more details before any discussion.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I will once again share my screen and just go over. Staff has prepared some tentative language around these different ideas, and I can walk you through that. Actually, before I start, I'll also mention that this issue was something that was debated at the level of the Planning and Sustainability Commission in their hearing. It was one of the dominant issues in their hearing as well. And they did, some of the amendments that we'll discuss here were also discussed by the Planning and Sustainability Commission. This was one area where eventually they adopted the package unanimously, but some of the amendment votes on this particular topic were split votes, and that's they did not make any changes to this aspect of the proposal. So the first topic that the commissioner mentioned was the idea of excluding various natural resource overlay designations in the zoning map from the temporary shelter clause. Those include the environmental overlays, the river natural overlay, the river environmental overlay, and the Pleasant Valley natural resource overlay. All of those have the commonality that they're there to serve to protect identified natural resources throughout the city. And I'll mention that we've drafted language for tentative language for some of these, for all of these options that we're discussing today. But some of these affect the same section. So one of the things we would do next after today is, depending on your general direction, we may have to weave some of these together because they're not all mutually exclusive. And so we've, in several instances, we have not done that weaving together part. I just wanted to mention that. So that's what the change to H is related to that. That's the 180-day in a calendar year clause that has been the subject of a lot of testimony.
Eric, can I just ask a clarifying question? I hate to be stupid. So what I'm seeing here in purple, that is added language. Is that correct, or are you just highlighting that as an area for proposed change?
Yeah, that in this case that's added language. The non-highlighted is already part of the proposal. It simply says that mass and outdoor shelters are allowed as a temporary activity for up to 180 days in a calendar year, and we'd be adding the statement that the natural resource overlays are excluded.
Okay, good. So we're just being more specific in terms of the language as opposed to stating intent. We are now being explicit about it in the language.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's never really been an intent from any of the either the Joint Office or the various bureaus involved with this to put shelters in these overlays, but making it explicit is what we're doing here with this language.
Yeah, I support this. I think that'll put a lot of people at ease.
The language below to 33-285 is parallel language that would deal with permanent shelters. And it's been staff's suggestion that if you're going to identify a list of overlay zones in the temporary section, you might want to have the same list in the permanent chapter. And right now, the permanent shelters are prohibited in the environmental overlays in the scenic and the flood hazard area, but they do not exclude the, it does not currently list the Pleasant Valley or the 2 river overlays that are related to natural resources. And so we wanted to correct that alignment issue if you're going to make changes to the section H in 296. Any other questions about that?
Commissioner Maps has a question. Mingus, you're still muted there.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No
I have a question about the H here. Mass and outdoor shelters are only allowed for 180 days within the calendar year. Help me think about this scenario where, let's say we open up a mass a mass shelter in July, stays in place for 180 days, then the calendar ends. Can you then basically keep the shelter in place for another 180 days?
It's per calendar year, so as written, yes, although as a practical matter, what we've heard from most of the shelter providers is the need is really in the winter. So and for smaller periods in the summer during heat or smoke days. And so a more likely scenario is someone would open something up in October or November and keep it open over the winter, and you'd be straddling both years. So you're saving your allowance for the next fall essentially. So it's less likely that you'd be open for 360 days in one streak, but technically yes, the language does allow that.
Maybe at some point I'd love to unpack that a little bit with my colleagues and staff. But thank you.
And I'll just mention here too, this section, the current language that's recommended refers to mass shelters as well as outdoor shelters. And just a brief reminder that mass shelters is the technical zoning term for the indoor shelters where people are in congregate rooms essentially. And then the outdoor shelters would be the village model or that kind of situation. Okay, if there are no other questions, I would move on to the next topic that was identified by the commissioner. And this was dealing with the paved parking lots. And once again, this is changing the same section. So if we like more than one of these, we'll weave them together. But for now, what this does is breaks out the mass shelter and outdoor shelters into separate clauses. And then for the outdoor shelters, it excludes things that are not an existing paved parking area from that provision. And so the mass shelters we did not modify because those are by definition indoors. And the outdoor shelters would be the ones that would be outside. So we'd be saying that that would be something only appropriate in the parking area. A reminder that the outdoor shelters include a couple different possible models. The term is broad enough to cover things like the village model where people are living in small cabins or sheltering in small cabins, I should say. It would also include tents or yurts or vehicles which might correspond to what has been discussed with the safe parking model where you set up an area for people who are camping in their vehicles to be in a safer space than just beside the road. And so all of those different approaches are captured within the term outdoor shelter as currently drafted. The second aspect of this is if we're going to allow them in parking areas, we have to say something about what that means for required parking in the zoning code. And there's already a provision in the code that allows farmers markets to occupy required parking spaces for a period of time, and we would just add to that language there to make it clear that that the shelters can also do that. If we didn't make that second piece of this amendment, questions would come up about even though we theoretically allowed it in paved parking lots, the zoning code might imply that you can't do it because you'd be taking away required parking. So this is just clarifying that you can take away required parking temporarily as part of that use. Any questions about the approach here? Any other questions, I should say? So again, this was responding to the idea that although generally we did not have in mind using parks and open spaces and natural areas as a place to put outdoor shelters, there may be some limited situations where it would be appropriate, and parking lots were identified as one of those potential uses.
Eric, I do have a question for you. So right now what we're doing is we're talking about city property. And so in the event that, walk us through what would happen in the event that a decision was made somewhere, somebody got the idea that they wanted to use a parking lot for a temporary shelter, a parking lot in a parks facility. What would the procedure be? What would the process be?
Good question. And this is where it's important to understand that zoning is a an authorizing code. It doesn't dictate that something must happen if it's an allowed thing. And so what we're doing here is allowing it hypothetically through the zoning. The zoning would not be a barrier to this, but zoning doesn't authorize unauthorized uses of property from the perspective of the property owner. So if you're the property owner, if the Parks Bureau or BES or the Water Bureau, or there's also open space zoned land owned by Metro or ODOT in some cases, whoever the property owner was would still have to make that decision about whether they wanted to allow that use on the property. In the case of parks, they have existing procedures for how they permit non-parks uses temporarily on parks, and I would invite park staff is here in the room if they would like to speak to that particular question about how they would approach that.
Well, that would be helpful, and I think part of what I'm getting at is, that there are still checks and balances even within this, given that it is a parks facility and the public has a great interest in their parks facilities. It's ultimately still going to have to be approved by a sitting city commissioner, particularly the commissioner in charge, one would presume.
Yeah, all the zoning code does is by removing the zoning code piece, you are authorizing it to happen without having to go through BDS to ask the land use question, but it doesn't mean that there isn't still an internal process or a public process for deciding how parks may want to use their sites.
Yeah, and that's really the larger point I want to make. We're dealing with base zoning codes here. And as anybody who develops anything in this city will tell you, that's just the starting point. There's more to the process than that.
Todd, I believe Todd from the Parks Bureau is here. I don't know if he had anything else to add to that, to what I've described.
Hey, Todd.
Hello, Todd Lofgren, Deputy Director, Portland Parks and Recreation. We have binding city policy through our non-park use permit, where temporary construction staging or other non-park uses are approved. That is like a real estate agreement or a permit of use for parks property. However, it doesn't require a public process, or there's not a specific kind of proposal review process that's external. It's an internal staff review that's then approved by the Parks Director.
Thank you.
Any other questions about this section here? Okay. The next section that we looked at was, well, I guess those are all the sections that deal with temporary uses of parks or open space land. And I think the next topic then potentially goes into some of the other aspects of open space and other shelter aspects.
So Eric, before you go to the next section, let me ask you the opposite question, which is today we have a lot of people who are houseless, who are living in open spaces and parks and a whole host of places trying to exist on the streets in the city of Portland. After passing what ultimately ends up at the city council, this is not forcing people into specific places to camp?
No, well, the zoning code doesn't really govern how the city wants to handle the unauthorized or informal camping that's occurring right now on the street or in parks or in any other public space. This governs the permanent siting of facilities or the temporary siting of facilities. So the operational decisions about how the city wants to handle that and the county would be up more to the joint office and the city council.
So the city council would have to take a proactive stance in order to exclude people from areas that they are sleeping in today.
I mean, the broad intent of this package is to facilitate the permitting of more managed facilities so that we can have better options than the informal camping that we're seeing today.
I
But-
totally understand that, but my
But how you want to make that transition is sort of a separate question.
Yes, and so that is my question. I mean, I'm getting questions about what does this mean for people today who are not in a managed camp. I know that we also have a proposal out with the Joint Office to create new partnerships around setting up managed camps. But I just want to make sure that it's on the public record that this is this land use change gives us more options, but it is not mandating anything.
Correct. And it also does not, for folks who are camping in public spaces right now, it does not necessarily make them suddenly legal or more legal than they are today. This is again about public facilities and hopefully giving us better options for places that have services where people can be sheltered in a more humane way.
Yes, thank you.
And I know Mark Jolan, I believe, is on the call. I don't know if the Joint Office has any other comments from an operational perspective about that question. Okay, hearing none, I'll move on then. As I mentioned, I think those were the primary amendments that we've heard from in terms of helping to clarify the open space and natural areas questions. So the other items on the list, I think, are slightly different topics.
I was bound to do that once, at least today. Does that then complete your presentation of amendments that are being proposed from the staff perspective?
On that particular topic, yes, but once you move on to the next topic, we'll have more to share.
Okay, and what is the next topic?
My understanding was that the next topic was more broadly permanent sheltering in the open space zone. You had some testimony about from the Portland Neighbors Welcome about providing some path for permanent facilities in the open space zone, and then we needed to talk about that testimony.
Okay, and so do you okay, that's fine. Why don't you talk, that starts getting at rights of way, minimum lot size, the RV questions, that sort of thing?
RV questions would come at the end of the session
Okay,
today.
why don't you go ahead and walk us through all of that? Why don't you facilitate and just walk us through that? That would be helpful.
Okay.
Go through those different areas as you see them needing to be called out.
I'll share my screen again then.
Thank you.
This next topic was, you heard in the testimony from Portland Neighbors Welcome a request to allow permanent facilities in the open space through some kind of council action. And then staff have looked at that, and there's really two approaches to that request if council wanted to make that. And we've recommended some slightly different language than what came in through the letter that you received, mostly so that terminology lines up with what we use elsewhere in the zoning code. So the one way you could achieve council approval of that, if it was desired, would be to allow that through a type 4 procedure through a conditional use. And a type 4 procedure is automatically going to include a council hearing. So we've come up with language that would do that by amending one of the sections of 33-100, and then also in section 285 you would clarify that outdoor shelters and right now this version is showing outdoor shelters, but a similar approach could be taken if there was council interest in other types of shelters. What we've done here in this section here is to show that it's a type 4 procedure under number B sub 1 there. So that's one way to do it, is through a land use review if you wanted to do it through the zoning code. Another way that has been discussed, and I don't have specific language for this because this is not the zoning language, but Commissioner Rubio mentioned the idea of a separate directive outside the zoning code to ask bureaus that have property to identify surplus property, and that would of course include some land that's in the OS zone. And if you did end up identifying land that's currently zoned OS that's not being used as a park or natural area, where you felt that shelter or housing was appropriate, it's always possible to rezone that property through a future planning action. And so you could essentially include a directive in this ordinance to go search for more property that would lead to a follow-up planning action.
Eric, I do have a question on that, if I may, Mayor.
Yeah, please.
So today, if a bureau that cannot use the land that they own, by city policy, they are required to first offer it to another bureau, and then second, sell it for the highest dollars amount they can get. So if we are thinking that there's land that we currently own and other governments own, then that policy will have to change at the council level. It will not change just based on us changing this. Am I accurate?
Yeah, you would. All this would do would be to direct that inventory, and then you would have to come back and decide what policies need to be changed and what zoning or policies or any other regulation needed to be changed once you've come up with that list of properties that you think are appropriate.
Can't we just change the policy prior to having a list, just knowing that this is coming back?
You could, yeah. That we did not write that option up, but there's nothing in this approach that would preclude that.
Thank you.
I guess the other thing is just a reminder on this, if this approach is taken, a reminder once again that there are a variety of agencies that own property. So you'd want to engage with all of those entities and make sure they saw this coming. The other thing I guess I'll mention about this approach is that when you take the zoning approach, as is evidenced by the testimony you're getting right now, that everyone who lives near a park is going to have a certain amount of concern or worry that their site might be up for some use. Taking the inventoried approach would potentially reserve the concern once you had identified sites for the actual sites that are being identified, rather than having a concern spread throughout the community for all possible parks and open spaces. And I think that the zoning staff, I think, believe that the inventory approach is a cleaner way potentially, because the zoning code, doing a conditional use review through a type 4 procedure in an open space, that would be a challenging review, and you may get a better process if you just consider it through a zone change after after identifying the potential properties. And again, both of these options are only if you choose to entertain the Portland Neighbors Welcome testimony that they would like some narrow provision for use of permanent facilities in open space areas. So that's any other questions or thoughts on that topic?
Not seeing it.
Okay. The next one is a technical change that staff is asking. When we wrote the definition of outdoor shelter, we were a little bit less than elegant when it comes to how we wove the vehicle question into that. That was an addition sort of midway through the process that we wanted to make sure we were accommodating the potential for the safe parking facilities under this definition. And so there's two places this definition shows up. One is in Title 33 and the other is in Title 30 for purposes of some fee exemptions. And so In
Can
both
you
cases,
step back, Eric, and because I'm sorry, I'm getting a little lost in the weeds here, and I want to make sure I know what you're talking about. When you say the vehicle issue, there are two vehicle issues that were raised during public testimony last week. There was the question of RVs, and I think that's what you're referring to, but there was also the question of these tiny homes on wheels. Can you just be really clear about what you're talking about so I don't...
yes, neither of those. What we're talking about is for the outdoor shelters, which is our definition that encompasses a broad array of village style or outdoor style shelter facilities. So this is not the individuals in RVs or tiny houses.
I'm confused. You mentioned vehicles. What does this have to do with vehicles? I'm still not tracking.
So with the outdoor shelter model, originally we wrote it without the word vehicle in there, and we were just talking about potential cabins or yurts or sort of the village model of sheltering. We added vehicles to this because for two reasons. One is that there may be situations where tiny houses on wheels would be used as the thing that people are sheltering in a managed shelter facility. And second was that we wanted to include within this definition the capacity to handle the safe parking style of facility where people who are camping in cars or other types of vehicles would have a safe place to go that's better than being on the side of the road. And so the definition includes vehicles in the list of possible accommodations in an outdoor shelter. We did that in a slightly confusing way, and we just have a rewording suggestion that's down below to make it a little clear, we think. The other thing I guess I'll mention about this definition is that BES has mentioned to us that this last sentence where it says may or may not include buildings that have food, preparation, or shower facilities, it might be better to say sanitary facilities here because we didn't mean to just imply that it could only be showers. So that might be a further word swap that we suggest, but that's just recent feedback we got from BES. The main thing again is that the word vehicles was up here in the original language, and we've just reworded the sentence to be, I think, less ambiguous. Okay. And again, this is tentative language, so you can ask us more questions about this before you vote on it. The next item starts to get into the question of shelters on institutional sites in single dwelling zones. And maybe I'll skip over that one for the moment and go to the site size question. This was something that had come up with regard to, right now the standards for outdoor shelter have a 5,000 square foot minimum site size. And through discussions with about some existing facilities, that it was noted that we have at least one facility out there that's slightly smaller than that today, and we may want to be slightly more flexible. So you could either, the existing recommendation is on top here and it has 5,000 square feet. The wording down below would just remove that whole standard, but you could also just change the number to a different number if that was what was being contemplated. And Mayor, I believe this one was coming from your office. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
The question there was simply, no, that's fine. That's fine. There was a reason why I was less concerned about the maximum size than I was the minimum size. And I wanted to know where the 5,000 square feet came from. It seemed arbitrary. We already have some shelter sites out there that are less than 5,000 square feet. And just off the top of my head, I think like R2D2 probably fits into that category just by way of example. the whole point of this exercise in this regard was there were faith institutions that wanted to use their facilities potentially to set up organized, managed sheltering options, but they didn't have 5,000 square feet. I wasn't comfortable going down to 0 though. And so I left that open as a point of discussion. I still want to make sure we're talking about professionally managed site as opposed to unsanctioned. And if you get down to 0, you're starting to talk about more of a mom and pop rather than an institution or a trusted partner that would probably want to scale at a larger level. So I was hoping maybe you could make some recommendations as well.
Okay, one of the logics behind having a standard at all is that there are other development standards that apply to shelters, like a setback along the edge of the property and things like that. And so if you get super small, then it becomes infeasible to meet many of those other development standards. But whether it's 5,000 or 4,000 probably is not too much of a concern. But I think if you were down in the range of 1,000 or 2,000, you would not be able to meet some of the other development standards that are in the code.
Are we talking temporary or permanent shelter here?
This is permanent shelter standards.
Okay. I agree with the mayor. I think 5,000 might be too much. 3,000 might be what? Fine. I'm not sure what, because every shelter I've seen has been different configurations. And as a board member of Human Solutions, I've been into a lot of shelters, and most of them, I don't think would fit the 5,000 square foot criteria.
Yeah, and for reference, the 5,000 is kind of a standard size lot in Portland in many cases. But our minimum lot size just as a reference point, our minimum lot size for residential single family development is 3,000. So that may help just get a scale sense.
It does.
So Eric, this is all great. We could go through the entirety of the document in fine-tooth detail, and if that's what my colleagues would like to do, we can certainly do that. But I'd sort of like to keep us focused on the big issues that we heard public testimony around. This issue here is sort of a minor issue.
Yeah, and we can adjust this number on the fly next week.
I mean, you've heard sort of the balancing act that Commissioner Hardesty and I are trying to do here, and I don't know if it's 5,000, 4,000, 3,000. I just know it's not 0. I don't want to eliminate the minimum threshold, and I'll rely on your good judgment on that thing. But I think maybe we should move towards comments or discussion on the amendments that we previously were introducing related to open space. I think that's where the majority of the conversation was last week. And I think maybe that's where the council would like to focus its attention. But I see Commissioner Ryan has his hand raised. We'll go to Commissioner Ryan.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Actually, I took your cue that we could move into some open dialogue amongst ourselves.
Good.
So, okay. And I just wanted to start off by thanking you, Eric, for that thorough presentation. It was really, really helpful. And I'm also grateful to my colleagues and the excellent Bureau staff. And I want to acknowledge Commissioner Rubio. I know we've had many talks over the last month about just kind of having a methodical, thoughtful process, because this is such a necessary and complex proposal. So I really appreciate your leadership in how you've laid this out. It really is landing well. I think all of you know, as Portlanders, we have to be thorough and transparent about what many would say is the #1 issue that's gripping our city, and that's the houselessness crisis. And we're doing just that today, and I appreciate that. And I wanted to get my voice in here because as a commissioner who's in charge of the bureaus that are on the front lines, providing aid to those impacted by the houselessness crisis, I believe that success looks like having enough open space to open enough shelters with access to services across the city so that we can meet a goal that we can all agree on. And I'll just go ahead and start off with a goal that all Portlanders have a safe space to rest and find stability and access to those services that will lead to that housing and stability. So the status quo just can't continue. And that's why we're here and why we're looking at these important codes. This can happen in parking lots, buildings, undeveloped land. What is clear is that we need a wide array of choices throughout the city to meet all the needs that we see every day. Whether we're talking about our neighbors suffering on the streets or unsanctioned camping in our parks and sidewalks, the status quo, again, is just not going to cut it. It's a public health crisis, and the amendments that we have on the table are a major step in that right direction. And speaking of steps, this was brought up a little bit earlier. We have some action in motion at the moment. We have actually over 36 respondents to the Joint Office's request for proposals for alternative shelter ideas. The desire is to meet this need that is out there, and we also have $3 million in proposed funding for the alternative shelters from the Here Together proposal amendment, but the voters passed the proposal, the measure the voters passed last May. We have so much to do, and it's important to know that we can be agile at these times of emergency, and we need to be able to respond to a crisis as they come up. So I appreciate the dialogue, and I also appreciate that we all realize that this has to be nimble and urgent and agile as we do this work. And so taking this time and being deliberate and methodical and thoughtful right now on the front end is going to save us so much time as we go forward. Anyway, I just want to get us started into the open dialogue and saying that I'm really looking forward to discussing these amendments. Thanks again, staff, for listening so thoroughly to the testimony last week and for connecting with all of our offices. And I think all of us have staff members who have been working really hard on this, and I know that we're all grateful for that. Anyway, I'm looking forward to the dialogue today. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Sorry.
I know, got a little hungry, huh? Totally understand.
A little product break. Yes, thank you. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for that, Commissioner Ryan. It is fabulous when I feel that the entire City Council is in sync around a vision, and I believe that we are in this case. I think clearly there's still some questions out there. Clearly the community has questions that hopefully we started to help answer today. And I will say that I appreciate us using every avenue possible to address the growing houseless population that are living on our streets. As we heard today at the communications, there are a lot of reasons why people are on our streets, medical reasons, other loss of jobs, loss of housing for whatever reason. There's a lot of reasons why people are on our street, and I appreciate the thorough approach that we're taking to making additional options available. If we were actually going to start banning people from camping in places without us having adequate spaces for people to be, I would be very opposed to that. Because again, unless we are able to provide a safe shelter for all the people who are houseless, we cannot, with a good conscience, start pushing people into places that may or may not fit what their individual needs are. So I am really supportive of the direction that we're going. And I think, we won't get it all done this time, but we can always come back and continue to refine it to make it better, so that it lives up to the values that we are putting into this work. So I want to really thank Commissioner Rubio for her openness in this process and really her inclusive nature to make sure that she was talking to all of us every step of the way through this process. I think that is a model that we all appreciate and know that we get a lot better policy when we take the time to have those conversations and take the time to build support across the board. Commissioner Rubio, great job. I look forward to us coming back. And again, I don't think we'll fix it all. As to Commissioner Mapp's point earlier, I do think we don't want to slow this down while we get it right for RVs. I do think the last thing we want to do is exacerbate the issues that require that allow people to be houseless in the first place, our policy shouldn't be putting more burden on low-income folks who don't have resources today. So I really support thinking about how do we do that in a way that really is specific to that need, as well as the need on tiny homes on wheels. Because I'm still not quite sure why that's an issue, but I think clearly we need to do a little bit more work on that. So thank you all. I think this is really good work. And again, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability is kind of that group that just works behind the scenes for years, engaging people and trying to make good public policy. And I just want to, again, appreciate the work that they've done. So thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Hardesty. So, and I know, Eric, you started to go into the outdoor shelter definition and the minimum site size definition, but I want to focus narrowly for a moment here on the open space. Before we move on to those two, I want to make sure that we're given clear guidance to the Bureau around amendments related to open space. And we heard a number of specific language suggestions on the open space, particularly around, I would describe it as exclusionary language. It's language that clarifies the intent of the City Council around natural areas and open spaces. Was there any further discussion on that issue or any further guidance that we would like to give the bureaus with regard to what Eric and Joe had mentioned around the open space questions? Are we generally head nod good then with the direction that staff had proposed? Very good. And again, to the public, if you do not agree with this, let us know. Please, the record remains open and you can still testify to us directly at cctestimony@portlandoregon.gov. That's also available on the website. The next area, Eric, that you had mentioned then was around outdoor shelter definition. And could you be more specific in terms of the guidance that you're asking this council for with regard to the definition?
I think the definition change we saw as a technical rewording. So we just want to make sure you're not confused about that and whether you had any other questions.
Colleagues, any further questions, or do we feel that we've given sufficient guidance based on the presentation Eric gave? I'm giving a thumbs up. I see Commissioner Hardesty, Rubio, Maps, Ryan, we're all good. Minimum site size, I don't know if anybody else has anything else to contribute to that conversation. Eric, you heard some slightly nebulous feedback from Commissioner Hardesty and myself, but that's the best we could come up with for right now. I think you heard the intent that we're trying to address. I appreciate that you're trying to make it consistent with the standard lot size in the city of Portland. That actually makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, I think we can be slightly more flexible, just not down to 0. And I'll let you maybe think on that over the course of the next couple of days and maybe make some suggestions. Maybe somebody else out in the community has a couple of ideas too that could help us with that. So what else do we need to give you guidance on in order for you to feel satisfied that you can draft some amendments?
The next topic, I think, in the T was the question that had come from a variety of testimony around whether faith-based institutions, religious institutions in single dwelling zones should have more flexibility. So this would be moving away from the open space.
One second, I apologize. Commissioner Ryan has his hand up.
I kind of jumped too soon. I wanted to hear what Eric had to say on this, and then I have some comments. Yeah.
Okay, you just jump in when Eric's done then.
Okay, so if it's all right, I'll share that document again. So the background on this topic was that if you recall, for those of you who were on the council last year, when you adopted the Expanding Opportunities for Affordable Housing project, you gave institutions in single family zones, which are primarily religious institutions, but some other things like Rotary and some other groups like that. You gave institutional uses more flexibility to use their site for affordable housing projects without reopening their conditional use permit. And in that project, we had testimony, and then we've had some testimony throughout this project that we should be more flexible with shelters as well with those same sites. And so that was part of the Portland Neighbors Welcome testimony as well. They had asked that we reconsider that and be more flexible. The current recommendation provides for it to be a type 2 conditional use if an institution is putting shelters on their site. The one exception is shelters serving domestic violence victims are currently allowed by right up to 3,500 square feet in the proposal. Outdoor shelters with more than 20 individual sites would be prohibited in the single dwelling zones, and that's the current recommendation. And then also just a reminder that under state law, religious institutions are currently allowed to host a small number of people camping in vehicles. That's outside the zoning code. That's just the state law direct provision. So that's the status of the current proposal. In response to the Portland Neighbors Welcome testimony, staff had come up with language that could be added to Chapter 33-285 that would be similar to what we had done with affordable housing, essentially allow in the single dwelling zones up to 20 shelters, 20 shelter individual shelters, which would be either beds or pods, if you will, when it's on a site of an existing institutional use. So that's changing there. And then
Eric, before you move off of that, can you define for us in code, when you say existing institutional use, does institutional have a very specific meaning when we're talking about zoning?
Yes, and about 85% of what that means is religious institutions, but it also might, there are some cemetery sites, there are some private schools that fit into that category. There are a few fraternal organizations that have clubhouses that fall into this category. So it's a term that is referring to it's generally a group use that is doesn't need to be religious, but it's of a similar nature where you've got people congregating in an institutional setting in a single dwelling zone in this case.
I think we can all agree a cemetery would not be the right place.
Right.
So would it hurt to be a little more specific?
You could, and we could explore subsets of this. The general reason for using institutional use is we don't want to necessarily use the zoning code to give religious sites a specific right to do something that non-religious sites don't have for religious freedom reasons, but we could be slightly more specific there.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing I guess I would add about this proposal is that although we've had testimony about this topic throughout the process, this would be a change in the proposal, and it by itself could be something that a lot of people might have an opinion about. And so similar to the suggestion that you might want to have more discussion of the RV and tiny house thing, if the council would like to go down this road, I think staff has thought that you may want to open up testimony for this particular topic by itself so that you have a little more direct public feedback on this, because I think this topic has been lost in the overall flurry about open space. And shelters on church sites could be as controversial as the neighborhood park in some situations, and you may want to give people a chance to weigh in on that.
Yeah, of course. And I think we've actually been very transparent on that point, that certainly we would welcome people's feedback.
And Mayor, you may remember, we've actually talked about camping on church lots quite a few times. And you may remember that we actually slowed it down, some of them, so that we could do it right. So I think the public has had a lot of opportunity to weigh in on that particular issue. Because I don't think we're changing the rules at all. Are we?
As I mentioned, the current state law allows a limited number of people to camp on church property already. This would be an expansion of that up to 20 and would give more flexibility, not just with vehicles, but with other formats. So it would be an expansion compared to what's allowed now. But as you said, this has certainly been discussed for quite some time.
Right. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? The next topic down on my list was the question about the right-of-way stuff. So we'd be switching gears again unless there are other thoughts.
All right, anything more on that, folks, before we let Eric switch to right-of-way?
No, I was going to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you bet. Commissioner Ryan.
Yeah, actually, Eric, you basically answered everything in detail. Our office, I was just very attached to this one. So I appreciate all the work that you did and the way you presented it. Thank you. I'm glad that we listened to the testimony from Portland neighbors. Welcome on this. I am, Mark Jolin, are you there? Let me look. There you are. Since we were talking about the size of these lots, and I know you have a lot of perspective and some insight and a point of view that would be helpful, I think, for everyone to catch at this moment.
I'm happy to. So for the record, Mark Jolin with the Joint Office of Homeless Services. And Eric, you may be able to shed some light on this, but as I'm thinking about the minimum size or that was up for discussion, the 5,000 feet, there's a model of safe park that exists in Eugene and some other communities where you have a single operator, but you have a small number of people living in vehicles or sleeping pods on multiple different sort of private pieces of private property around the community, and they're all being serviced by a single entity. So that kind of scattered site approach, I think, is something that we know does work in other communities. And I think as we think about minimum size of alternative outdoor shelters, is it possible to ensure that kind of model is still viable under this? I think that was the question. Want to be careful not to foreclose that as we think about a site having to be of a particular size.
I think from my perspective, minimum site size is something that is spread throughout the zoning code for a lot of different uses. So in most cases, for most land uses, there's a minimum size. So as long as the number here is not a huge number, it shouldn't provide too much of a barrier to that sort of thing. The definition of site can be either inclusive of the entire property or a subset of it, depending on how it's being used, and there's some flexibility about that. So, I think if we picked a number there that was a little bit smaller than 5,000, that you would not be, that would not present too big of a restriction in terms of that dispersed model, because most of the sites you're going to be dispersed on would still be of that size.
Thank you.
All right, so I think you have a head nod there, Eric, and you can move us into the next area.
Okay, I will share again. And as I mentioned, this is this next topic has to do with the right-of-way. One of the elements of this project was to look at temporary encroachments into the right-of-way as it relates to various forms of services to the homeless population. And we have, the recommendation includes amendments to Title 17 in section 17.44. And as we've gotten closer to the finish line here, PBOT has noted that they are still a little uncomfortable with this section and would like to have it addressed in a longer term effort that they're undertaking to clean up other aspects of Title 17. And it's also been noted that Section 17.24 is a broader encroachment permitting process that gives them quite a bit of flexibility. So some of the things we were trying to do with 17.44, they believe they can accomplish under existing code through a different section. And so they've requested that we drop this element of the proposal in order for more work to be done through a different process. And we've reviewed that and don't think that it presents any kind of significant barrier to what we're trying to accomplish with the project to defer that piece. You did get some amendment requests from Portland Neighbors Welcome to further amend this, and we think that that's not necessary because the other section I referenced in 17.24 already essentially provides that capability. So our recommendation has been to drop this section. For reference, I've got it up on the screen, but we would just drop amendments to this section and leave it as is for now. And I don't know if there's any PBOT folks who want to add to what I just said, but we're comfortable with the idea that the current code probably provides us enough flexibility in the short term.
Hi, this is Amber Clayton, Portland Bureau of Transportation. I just want to thank and affirm everything that Eric has said. The original intent around the code language was to clarify that we would be able to support service providers and OMF in particular as being able to permit sanitation and hygiene. And those are things that we are already doing in partnership. So we don't feel that at this time any additional code changes are necessary to support the work that we're already doing to support all of our various partners in this work. Thank you, Eric.
Any other questions about that?
So, Eric, if I understand correctly, then we're maintaining the status quo on that section, correct? You're simply eliminating it.
It would be an amendment to eliminate that section of the proposal, but it's maintaining the status quo of the current code.
From a code perspective, it's the status quo.
Yeah.
All right, cool, thanks.
Okay, we already talked about minimum site size. Those are all the elements I had on my list until you get to the RV and tiny house topic. So do we want to shift gears to that topic?
Yeah, I think we do. Yeah, I'm seeing head nods all around. Let's go.
Okay, so I'll start by just introducing the topic and reminding you that when we started this package, this topic was not part of the original council directive that caused this project to happen.
Eric, I'm sorry to interrupt you. So I'm getting word from legal counsel that she feels there hasn't been clear direction on the discussion of permanent shelters in open space. Can we get a clarification from legal counsel on that, please?
Mayor, I'm just following Eric's list and I'm watching head nods. Eric has identified one item as allow permanent shelters in open space via an act of council. He identified two particular options. I did not hear from council which of the options they were interested in. And if Eric's comfortable, I'm good with that, but I didn't hear it.
I was going to assume that both options are still on the table for discussion next week, unless the council would like to give us a direction on one of those two options.
Can you give us a succinct summary of the two options, please?
Sure. The first option was a direct translation of the Portland Neighbors Welcome request that there be a land use zoning approval process for a permanent shelter in the open space zone, and we had suggested a type 4 procedure for that. The alternative approach is outside of the zoning code, so you'd maintain the prohibition on permanent shelters in the open space in the zoning code, but instead you would direct bureaus that own property to take inventory and identify surplus property that could be directed towards shelters or affordable housing. And some of that could be open space. And if it was, we'd rezone it if it was going to be used for that purpose rather than trying to build in an allowance within the zoning code.
All right, thank you. And Joe, I think you have your hand raised too, but I'm not 100% sure. Is that a hand raise?
It is not, Mayor.
Oh, okay, sorry. Very good. Colleagues, I don't know if you had any thoughts on those two comments that Eric made, those two directions. Why don't we flesh that out a little more, Eric? And I'd like to hear from the public on it, because honestly, I don't feel like I have a strong preference one way or the other. It feels to me that the first option gives more, either option, well, the first option, if I understood you correctly, it would have to come back to council, or it would have to go through a zoning process. Is that correct?
The first option, a type 4 procedure, does by nature go back to city council. So that would have to go back to city council.
Okay, and then the second option?
The second option, if you directed bureaus that own property to identify surplus property, I presume that any disposition of that property would also have to come back to you in some form. It just would not be through a zoning process.
Okay, so explain to me why we should care. I guess I'm not tracking.
I think, you know, that the first option retains an allowance for permanent shelters in the open space zone. And that may make people nervous because you're still allowing for that possibility.
But it would still have to go through a public process at the council.
Correct.
If I understood
Correct.
you correctly.
Correct.
So that's how it is now.
Right. The second option of doing a non-zoning solution and identifying property would also come back, because if it was open space, you'd need to rezone it as well. So it's whether you want to go through a conditional use process or a zoning process. I think the main difference in my mind is that if you're going to have a provision in the zoning code, you are potentially, I think more neighbors of public property may be nervous because you haven't yet excluded the possibility that their park is going to be subject to that.
The use is an affirmative step. In other words, the conditional use would require whoever wants to sponsor this to actually come forward. And is there also a notification process with either of these?
But for both, yeah. I mean, if you were going to rezone a property or go through a conditional use, either way, you would be getting neighbors notice. I think if people are looking for a categorical exclusion of the open space zone in the zoning code, the second option is cleaner because it does that, but it still gives you the wiggle room to rezone in the future, which is always your prerogative.
Right.
So the second option probably sends a slightly stronger signal of that you're not going to be seeking open space land for this, but both are, from a procedural perspective, they both offer neighbors a future opportunity once you've identified a specific proposal.
Okay, and our intent here is obviously not to freak everybody out and scare our constituents. So given that, it sounds to me, and I'll take a stab, it sounds to me like the conditional use process would probably give people more confidence that there is a more rigorous public process associated with this.
I think it's that, you know, the zone, they're both similar processes.
Oh my God, please make a recommendation. This is getting...
So Mayor, I would say that we are the elected leaders. And
right.
If we say that we are not planning to do that today, then I think the public should accept that. And if we ultimately find out that we have some open space that we own, then we will go through whatever the public process is that we need to go through if we want to use it as housing. I don't want to lock us in boxes that we then have to take action to get out of. As a council, we should have as much flexibility as we need, because again, this crisis is going to get worse before it gets better.
Right, and so I'm trying to get to the answer, Commissioner Hardestein. I'm sorry if I sound impatient.
No, so my recommendation is
I'm trying to get to the answer because we have to choose one of these.
Yes, my proposal is that we go with A, which is as it reads today, rather than changing it to lock us into something that we have to come back and take another city council action if we need to.
Well, I'm hearing either way we do.
Well, I'm hearing both ways are a process.
Okay, Commissioner Maps knows the answer to this question. He's going to answer it for us. Commissioner Maps.
Well, I just noticed that Joe had his hand up earlier.
No, he actually doesn't. We concluded that.
I do now.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah, I have the actual hand. The most direct way is the rezoning approach, because you have your work. Either way, you're working with your bureaus if it's publicly owned sites to declare them surplus and to evaluate them for the mission of whatever the bureau owns that property for. And that will be a deliberative process, and we will talk through all of the pros and cons of that when we do the map change, the rezoning. And the conditional use is fine, but we actually then have to create the criteria by which the hearings officer, Eric, unless that's the wrong office, but BDS or that system, and then eventually you make that decision. And I think the more direct and easier to understand approach is to go look for sites, identify sites that you think might be of value, and rezone them at the appropriate time.
All right, that's compelling. It makes more sense to me, given that, to rezone than to go through the conditional use process. And Commissioner Hardesty, I think that's your point too. Is that accurate? All right.
I'll just add as well, Mayor, I think we're hearing that's more defensible in the short term from a legal perspective, because we don't then have to explain how that conditional use process will be consistent with the current purpose of the open space zone. Instead, we can just deal with the recategorization of that land on its face through the criteria that we would apply to a zone change.
Okay, and Lindley's about to crush our dreams of a resolution on this. Let's hear it.
No, I agree with Eric. I mean, from a policy perspective, you can do either. Defensibility wise, not having the conditional use approach works great. So yay.
Perfect. All right, good. Any objection to this as the direction that we should go? The zoning approach versus conditional use. I think we have it. Eric, well done. Congratulations. Joe, thank you. We have a head nod. Good work.
Thank you, Lindley. We would have just moved on and Eric would have been scratching his head.
Another day at the office, Eric. Another day at the office. Or the kitchen, as the case may be.
So I think we were going to transition to the RV and tiny house question when we...
Yeah, please.
As I mentioned before, this topic was added to the package in the fall after we had published an initial discussion draft and received feedback. And at that time, we were getting a lot of testimony supporting the inclusion of the RV and tiny house question. As most of you know now, the current city code precludes occupancy of an RV or a tiny house on wheels. But the city has been de-emphasizing enforcement of that code since 2017. So this was an attempt to sort of provide a longer term policy resolution to that question. For clarity, the zoning code currently does allow you to park an RV or tiny house on a residential property or any property. The zoning code governs where vehicles can be parked, and under state law and under the zoning code, we consider either an RV or a tiny house to be a vehicle, a tiny house on wheels, that is. And so this was added in the fall based on public testimony asking for it to be added. The Planning Commission discussed it to some extent and changed some of the standards that apply to it, but ultimately recommended that we include this element. Most of the testimony about it right now that you're getting is related to the requirement that we still have in the recommendation that the RV or tiny house, that the site hosting the RV or tiny house have a campground style utility hookup, including a sanitary sewer pipe hookup available. And I know that BES has some technical information about this aspect that they would be happy to share. I believe Marie is here from BES. And I know Commissioner Maps, that's your bureau, so I don't know if you have anything else to add by way of introduction.
I'd just like to invite Marie to help us understand this issue more thoroughly.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners, and all the folks listening in. I'm Marie Walkowitz. I'm Senior Water Resources Planner at Bureau of Environmental Services. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about the Shelter to Housing Continuum Project. I know it's been a very gratifying effort for our staff to be involved in, and we've appreciated the collaborative approach that BPS has set out and the work that's been happening across the variety of bureaus and with the commissioner's offices. Eric, would you pull up the presentation, please?
Thanks for the reminder. I'd forgotten that I was going to drive that for you. So bear with me while I find it. Sorry.
Thank you. Eric was kind enough to do that for me. So I appreciate Eric providing the context. This Shelter to Housing, really, the RV provisions sort of had their impetus in 2017 when Commissioner Udaley issued a temporary direction to BDS to deprioritize enforcement against people living in occupied RVs on residential and some commercial properties. You can go to the next slide, Eric. She did this in response to the growing concerns about housing affordability with the goals of offering creative solutions to create affordable housing, to support responsible tiny home and RV owners, to provide safe and sanitary housing for individuals in need, and in the interest of upholding safety and health standards. So she had this temporary directive that waived, essentially waived city code. What Shelter to Housing does is put into place code changes that allow permanent occupancy of RVs and tiny homes. So we go from this temporary situation in response to a crisis to permanent provisions that would allow people to live indefinitely in an RV or tiny house on wheels on a residential property. The provisions in Shelter to Housing require that people in RVs and tiny houses be served by basic utilities through a durable campground style hookup for electricity, water, and sewer. I'm going to focus most of my attention on sanitation, first of all, because I work at Bureau of Environmental Services. And second of all, that's, I think, where you got the majority of your testimony about these provisions. I want to clarify, we understand that not all RVs and tiny homes have plumbing. So those vehicles that do not have plumbing are expected that the residents would get access to sanitation through the hosting home on the site. So in those situations, in essence, the RV or tiny home operates as an outside bedroom. But for RVs and tiny houses with plumbing, the requirement is that they must be connected to the sanitary system by a campground style dump station. Next slide, please. So we understand that there is a lot of concern about costs related to making this connection. And I think this is one of the places where the Shelter to Housing Continuum Project has really shown a light on the need not only to be clearer in our code, but to see what we can do to make these costs proportional to what the impact is, and to support the need we have for affordable housing options. So I want to start by just acknowledging that through Shelter to Housing, permitting for sanitary connections would be a plumbing permit. The cost for the plumbing permit is $143 to make this connection. No system development charges would be levied, and the RV or tiny house on wheels actually connecting to an existing sewer line that's serving the main house on the site. So there's no need for laying a new sanitation line. So that's actually a very low cost. The other advantage of the plumbing permit is that it can be handled very quickly, which we know that there's sometimes concerns about how long permitting takes. Now, there's obviously a private cost also for making that connection, for making that physical connection happen. On many sites where we have the RV or tiny house located very close to the home and where the sanitary line is, these costs can be really low, really just a few $100s to make that connection from the RV to the sanitary line. But we want to acknowledge that in some situations, the cost could be quite a bit higher. We know that, you know, the slope of the property, the location of where the RV is going to be to where the sanitary line, there are other factors as well that could affect how inexpensive or costly it is to make that connection. One of the changes that BES is going to make in response to the shelter to housing program is to make available 2 loan programs that we already have in place so that folks wanting to make this connection can utilize these loan programs. These programs have been in place for quite a while, and they're in place to support people who are required to make a mandatory connection and understands that not everyone has cash on hand to pay for the private plumbing costs it takes to make those connections. The first program is the safety net loan program, and that's for income qualified individuals. The interest rate on that loan right now is 1.5% interest. People can ask to have the payments deferred for up to 5 years. That's sometimes renewable deferral. And then for folks age 62 years old or better, the deferral can be until the point of sale of the house. So essentially, they get a low-cost loan from the city to pay for their private costs of making that plumbing connection. And depending on their income and age, they may not have to pay back that loan until the home is sold. We also have a private plumbing loan program for other folks who may have a higher income but still lack the cash on hand to make the connections, to pay for those connections. Those loan programs have a more standard interest rate and a standard payback schedule. The other advantage we want to point out for requiring sanitary connection in terms of cost is that once that connection is made, there's no ongoing cost to the RV, the person living in the RV or the tiny house on wheels, unless it is to pay the person carrying the water bill and the sewer bill, pay them for their associated water use. So really, their only costs are related to that additional cost for water on the site. So next slide, please. I focused really on the practical sides because we know that for folks who have limited means and are really struggling with their housing, it comes down to how does this work for me and how can I afford it? So we totally understand that. We also have to think about why would we require this connection? So first of all, we just want to affirm that access to safe and dignified sanitation is a human right. And it's a serious concern we're hearing from folks experiencing houselessness, at risk of houselessness, and also of the broader community. Real concern about how do people get their hygiene needs met and what happens if they're not able to get those needs met. For RVs and tiny houses located on these single family lots, having this sanitary connection ensures that they have autonomy, which is also, I think, really important we all appreciate when we can have autonomy. So if they need to wash dishes or shower or use the facilities at any time of the day or night, they're not reliant on access to the adjacent house or the goodwill of their next door neighbor to get in whenever they need to. So we appreciate that. We understand that many people living in RVs or tiny house on wheel needs to be connected to a vehicle in order to be moved to a dump station. The nearest dump station right now is in Tigard. It costs $5 a visit to use that dump station. We also understand that not all RVs currently are mobile or able to be mobile. So having that sanitary connections means we don't have to worry about that. And by addressing those issues, we reduce the risk of illicit discharge. And unfortunately, illicit discharge of human waste and of other waste is a big problem with the city. We have people who are dumping sewage and other waste into Green Street facilities, so basically landscaped areas. Often even people who use RVs recreationally will dump their sewage into a main hole, thinking that it's connected to the sewer, when in fact it may be going into a sump in the ground and not going anywhere, or it could be going to a pipe that goes directly into the Willamette River or to streams. So that's a big problem. Bureau of Environmental Services is responsible for ensuring that we keep our waters clean and that we protect public health. And so when we have these illicit discharges, we're responsible for responding and cleaning those up. That's difficult, expensive, and requires enforcement against the people who are doing the discharge, which we'd rather prevent that situation and have things work well for the for people living in RVs rather than having to respond and react. As
So
I
Maria,
talked
if I
about,
could stop you for just a
Sure.
second and ask the question. Thank you.
Sure.
So let's talk a bit about the necessity to be hooked up to a sanitation system for RVs. We know that we have a lot of disabled RVs all over the city of Portland. I would suspect that most of the people who are living in vehicles that can't move would not have the resources to apply for a loan from anybody, even if it's the low income loan, low interest loan, nor would they actually qualify if that was the only thing they had was an RV that didn't work. So I'm curious as we talk about making safe spaces for RVs, are there other alternatives that you've looked at that wouldn't require each individual RV to have its own hookup? Like, for example, if we put facilities on a site where we're going to allow RVs to be, would that change your approach to this proposal?
So the elements of shelter to housing that I'm specifically addressing relate to RVs or tiny houses on a residential property. So someone owns a home and they're either living in that home or they're renting it out, but the owner of that home is giving permission to someone to live in their RV or tiny house on that property. So the responsibility then for making sure that the proper connections are made would be to the owner of the property. And then they would be the person who would seek the loan. So for instance, if I had a situation where I had a family member who was struggling financially, but they had an RV, I could invite them to live on my property, and then I would make sure that that property was properly serviced. For the RV situations like an outdoor shelter with RVs, there's more flexibility because those are managed shelters. So we have a public entity or nonprofit overseeing it. And so in those situations, porta potties can be used, mobile showers can be used, and all that, as long as they're following the correct provisions. Does that answer your question?
Sorry, I was on mute. It totally did. Thank you, Marie.
Okay.
That was absolutely what I was looking for and hoping for. That makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyway, so I already talked about the benefits for public health and safety. I think those are obvious. And I just wanted to just remind folks again that the ongoing costs of once that connection is put there are minimal. And you know, the costs of pumping are expensive, maybe not so much one visit, but they get expensive when you have to do that week to week to week. So with the connection already made, that's something folks don't have to worry about. So I was also asked to share with you a pilot project. This is not specific to shelter to housing, but related, about a pilot project that BES has just launched. And this is to provide sanitary pump out services for RVs that are occupied RVs that are currently on city streets. So this is a need that was identified by BES and PBOT staff, that we needed to do what we could to reduce folks disposing of waste in unhealthy ways. So we learned about a program that was piloted in Seattle, and we're modeling it after that. We have contractors that are working with folks who have been identified by field staff by field staff at BES and PBOT. They provide on-call service to RV dwellers Monday through Thursday. And then we have a route of established folks who know they need weekly service, or every other week service, and they are served on Fridays. The program is going to operate through June 30th. We have a budget of $10,000, and then we're collecting data as we go along in this process to see how it's used, where is the need, are there logistical issues that we need to consider in the program, and then we'll evaluate that and figure out next steps. So that's my presentation. Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Could I ask a question about what you're just discussing now, this pilot project, RVs on City Street? This is not part of the proposal that we're discussing, is it?
It is not. We are sharing it because we thought that the interests are very similar and that you'd like to hear about it while we had this opportunity.
Okay, and at some point, I assume you're bringing this back to the council with a different ask or a budget ask, or is this just, what do you want us to know about this right now?
This is just for your information. This is already covered in BES budget, where we don't have an ask for you. We know that shelter to housing in this conversation, it's raised a lot of questions and concerns about how people are getting sanitation. And so frankly, while we had the opportunity to talk with you, we thought we'd let you know.
All right, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the heads up. I will say this on this subject, and it's a separate and distinct subject. I would like more information, and I'd like to know more information holistically about what is the city's stance with regard to RVs. Where are we with this? And I know that when Commissioner Saltzman was here, he and I were very supportive of a program that was a pilot at the time to dispose of abandoned and dangerous RVs that had been used to make meth and everything else. They were toxic waste dumps, they were hazards, and the city of Portland was spending a lot of money to remediate those. And we still get a lot of complaints about RVs. One of the complaints that you correctly identify here is the disposal of waste into the storm drains, which is obviously a significant public health risk for obvious reasons. And so I guess on one hand, I'm glad that we're taking steps to protect the environment and the neighbors. On the other hand, I'd like more clarification on exactly what is the city's stance with regard to RVs that are parked illegally, or RVs that are abandoned, or RVs that are illegally discharging sewage. I just think we need a broader discussion, and I'd like to have that at some point. I guess I wouldn't like to have it, but I think I need to have it. Let's get it.
Mayor, I can tell you that we've been doing no enforcement since COVID hit, and it would be worthwhile for us to have a conversation as we start easing restrictions based on CDC recommendations around COVID. We made a tactical decision that, because of the CDC recommendations, that it was unsafe to try to move people during a pandemic. But I absolutely agree that we have a proliferation of RVs all over the city that we will need to talk about.
Yeah, good, because I remember prior to COVID, and you're correct, Commissioner Hardesty, during the COVID emergency, I do recall that under then Commissioner Udaley's leadership, that program was suspended. But I know we also passed an ordinance making it illegal to sell an RV in the city of Portland that didn't have a functioning waste system in it. And so I guess you're right that it would be great to go back and have a deeper review now that we're getting closer to herd immunity and people are getting their vaccinations. I think we need to front burner that conversation. But I just want to make clear for the public that's separate. It's completely distinct and different than what we're talking about today. It's not part of this series of ordinances.
Although, Mr. Mayor, if I may, colleagues, I think the conversation we're having right now points to the need for more discussion and more information about how RVs and tiny homes fit into this puzzle. And both the mayor and Commissioner Hardesty shared their concerns in this area. Let me share some of mine. As I'm torn between at least three competing interests. As the commissioner in charge of environmental services, I'm deeply committed to protecting our rivers from human waste. But I'm also taken back to testimony that we heard the last time we took up this issue. So for example, I think we were all charmed by Tricia, who came before council and asked us not to require us, city council, to hook up tiny homes to sewer systems because she had a composting toilet that seems to be effective for her, and she said that she could not afford to hook up to our wastewater disposal systems, and we certainly wouldn't want to displace her. At the same time, we also heard from Paul, who shared a moving story with us about his neighbor who lived in an RV and who also died in that RV, and he attributed that death to the fact that this neighbor did not have sanitation services inside the RV. So the stakes here, I think, are quite high. At this hour, I don't feel like we've had enough testimony on this. I don't want to table this issue, but I do think that it would be helpful to us and the public if we set aside a work session to specifically focus in on the pieces of this proposal which deal with RVs and tiny homes on wheels.
That makes sense, Commissioner Maps. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, Eric, where are we? What more guidance do you need from us?
Those were all of the topics that had been identified to me in terms of today's agenda. I guess it's appropriate to ask if there's anything any of the commissioners expected to talk about that hasn't yet been discussed before we go to next steps.
Mr. Mayor, colleagues, I do have a question. I don't know if this translates into an amendment. I hope that we can just get to this issue through picking the brain of staff. One of the concerns that we heard both in our last council session on this issue, and certainly I'm sure you're hearing it in your email and through the media, are the voices of our neighbors in East Portland who are concerned that some of the changes that we are looking at might overwhelm their neighborhoods with new shelters. Can someone from staff help us put those concerns into some context? Is that a likely outcome? And if so, what do we do about it? And if not, why not?
Sure, Commissioner, I could just put some context on that. The proposal that you have before you with regard to shelters, and I think this is probably covers all types of shelters, not just the outdoor shelters, allows a greater number of beds in a variety of different zoning designations, but primarily where we're being the most permissive are the commercial and multifamily zones where the number of shelter beds is being increased without the need for a conditional use review. There was a concern expressed that that because that those zones are common zones in outer East Portland, that would lead to them being an easier target for shelter siting. And I think also contributing to that sense is that land is cheaper there, it's flatter, parcels are larger. Having said that, the commercial and multifamily zoning exists in all quadrants of the city. And there are sites that will be available by right without a conditional use in North Portland, for example, on the Lombard corridor, in Northeast, Southwest Portland, the Beaverton Hillsdale Highway and Barber corridors both have extensive commercial and some multifamily zoning. The discussion you had about institutional sites and church property also comes into play here. Some of the East Portland neighborhoods supported adding those sites because there are some of those sites in Southwest Portland as well. We also heard testimony from East Portland requesting site separation requirements or neighborhood notification. And frankly, some of the testimony just asked that you exclude outer East Portland from having shelters at all. Although I think from the staff's perspective, we have shown through the information from the Joint Office that there are a number of, well, quite a few houseless people in outer East Portland that want to be served in their neighborhood. And so I don't think any of us have suggested that be the solution here. The Joint Office has shown information in their various presentations that before the emergency went into effect, most of our shelters were downtown, either downtown or on the inner east side. Under the emergency, they've substantially expanded the geography of where we have permanent shelters. So I think I'd be happy to have the Joint Office speak to this, but I think that we have not concentrated shelters over the past 5 years in East Portland. And so the track record, I think, shows that we've attempted to put them in a variety of different locations. But I can totally appreciate the concern, and I know that East Portland residents sometimes feel like they're not being heard, and so I think we need to talk about this. But I also think that the recommendation as written does provide options to open shelters in all quadrants of the city.
Thanks, Eric.
And I would just add, thank you, Eric and Commissioner Mapps. I really appreciate that question. I'll be talking to EPAP tonight, the East Portland Action Plan group. And I do know that they've had concerns as well, but I do think they're unfounded based on what we're seeing on the ground in the city of Portland. And I will also say that, but they're also right that the level of support services in East Portland is significantly less than it is in other parts of the city. So though we continue to have a high houseless population, the service supports are not in East Portland, and that will become more of a problem the longer we continue to have a houseless crisis on our hand. And so I do think that there are some concerns that are real, but I'm not worried about us being I say us because I live in East Portland. I'm not worried about us being oversaturated with houseless people, but I am worried about whether people are getting the services that they need the further from downtown they are, because that's where the concentration of services are. I don't know if Mark Jolin wants to weigh in. He put his camera on, so.
There he is. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mayor. Again, Mark Jolin, Commissioner Mapps. Thanks for the question. Eric did a really good job of summarizing, I think, what we've been saying, and the reality of shelter, and especially sustain the kind of shelter we're talking about in this measure, is that it will almost invariably involve public support and public funding. That's just in the nature of this, and so we through the Joint Office, through the city and the county, we'll have a lot to say about where we place shelter under this kind of opportunity structure that's been created with these amendments. And we've, I think, demonstrated our understanding that we need to geographically diversify our shelter system with the limited resources that we have. We're looking at what areas are underserved by shelter, where we see high concentrations of need, but not only that, also, where is that need not being addressed by existing shelter programs. So between that and all of the other criteria that need to go into a shelter siting decision beyond just the underlying zoning, proximity to transit, proximity to other amenities, ensuring that people can sort of stay as close as possible to their networks, there isn't a scenario I can envision where we would decide to locate a lot of our shelter capacity in one particular area simply because the land was less expensive, or simply because there were more lots of that in that zone there. I think what is attractive about this package is that it really does open up the entire city and all quadrants, as Eric said, of the city to sheltering. And I think if you look at what we've done, and certainly what we intend to do around this, geographic equity is going to be an essential piece of it. And I will say, just because I think sometimes it's framed as though shelter is a burden, it is really an asset to a community if it is run well. But it's an asset that we need to be able to offer equitably across the areas of the city. So I've heard the concern, but I share Commissioner Hardesty's sense that it's really not something that folks need to be concerned about in the way that it's been put out with respect to this particular code package.
Great, thank you for that input, Mark. We appreciate it. All right, so Eric, what else do you need from the council? You're muted, Eric.
Thank you. Before you adjourn, I think you want to make sure to talk about next steps.
Yeah, I'll get to that. I just wanted to make sure that there was no further discussion on the substance of the staff amendments that you proposed.
And I'll also mention that just as soon as we can manage to create the document, we will post a summary of these amendment ideas that have been discussed today to the project website so that people have something to refer to. And as you mentioned earlier, testimony remains open so people can weigh in on some of those ideas.
All right, awesome. So first of all, Eric, and to the rest of the staff, Joe, Mark, everyone else, I want to thank you for the tremendous amount of work that you've put into this and your colleagues have put into this in a very short period of time. We're very responsive to literally hundreds and hundreds of emails providing testimony, hours of public presentation. Last week, I think we had about 5 hours of public testimony on this. And I understand that you worked late into the night and over the weekend, and I really appreciate it. And I want to acknowledge the dedication that you and your respective Bureau staff members have put into this. So thank you. So next week, we will continue this item, and the assumption is we will vote on the proposed amendments. At that time, we'll consider motions on the amendment ideas that we've discussed today. Last week, at the close of the hearing, I extended the written comment period until 5 p.m. this Friday, the 26th, in order to give the public more time to offer their thoughts on the amendments we discussed today. And there are several times where we said we'd really like that input. I'd like to keep the record open for written comments until 5 p.m. on Tuesday, March 30th. So keep the record open till 5 p.m. on Tuesday, March 30th. And if we can do it, can we share a slide with the URL where comments can be most directly submitted? Is that, Eric, are you still in charge of the screen?
I will attempt to find that slide, yes.
Yeah, if you could look that up, that would be great. And while you're doing that, the next day or two, amendment language that we discussed today will be posted on the Shelter to Housing Continuum project page, which is located at www.portlandorgan.gov/BPS/S2HC. That's why we should really put that up. Put it up. Nobody's going to remember that. www.portlandorgan.gov/BPS/S2HC. And Eric, is that available on the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability website? If somebody just goes to your main page, are they going to find that, I hope? Or can we arrange it so that they can?
Yes, it is. And I'm sorry, I'm struggling to find the right slide, but I think I found it.
All right, good.
Okay, yeah.
You got it. Yeah, you got it.
That, there, and this is the link to the MAP app testimony system, which you can directly enter your comments into. As the mayor mentioned, you can also send it to the council email that he listed as well, but the app, it also allows you to read other people's comments, which is nice.
Yeah, that's a cool feature, by the way. So thank you for setting that up. And again, if people forget this URL, you can just go to the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability website, find the link there.
And this is the project website, by the way, just so people, it should be BPS and S2HC, so that's pretty easy to remember.
Thank you very much. Lindley, anything else that we need to cover from a legal perspective, given that this is a zoning related matter?
No, I think you covered it, Mayor. We have the record staying open until 5 p.m. Tuesday, March 30th. You've given 2 options for submitting that testimony, and then the hearing is continued to March 31st at 3 p.m. I think that should cover it.
All right, terrific. And there's one other item that I just want to bring to council and to the public's attention. So I want you to know, I'm letting council as well as the public know, our office has filed an emergency ordinance to be heard next week along the shelter to housing continuum for extending the housing state of emergency for 1 year. There were a number of comments about that in the last session. And so I just want to be very clear, as everybody anticipated, that we will be putting forth an emergency ordinance that has already been filed. It'll be heard next week, and that will extend the housing state of emergency for an additional year. And I'm sure that comes as a surprise to exactly nobody, but I thought I'd put that out there on the record. And with that, colleagues, thank you again. Great discussion, terrific staff work. Everybody, thank you. We are adjourned.
About that. The U.S. and its partners did join together this week to impose targeted sanctions over human rights abuses against Uyghur Muslims in China, but Thornton says there's much more work to do to get on the same page more broadly.
Right now, we've really got a lot of things to iron out ourselves on trade, on tariffs, on technology, on climate change issues, etc.
Secretary Blinken said he's had a positive reception in Europe. President Biden is looking to build on that when he speaks with his European counterparts virtually tomorrow. Michelle Kellerman, NPR News, Washington.
You're listening to All News.
It's 4:48, and there's more of OPB's All Things Considered coming up. First, some news we're following today. Pennsylvania Health Secretary Rachel Levine will be the nation's Assistant Secretary of Health. This makes her the first openly transgender federal official to win Senate confirmation. The Senate confirmed Levine today, voting mostly along party lines. In Pennsylvania, she emerged as the public face of the state's response to the coronavirus pandemic. Levine is expected to oversee Health and Human Services offices and programs across the U.S. And millions of pounds of radioactive fracking waste in an Arlington, Oregon landfill can stay there. The Oregon Department of Energy made that ruling today. This comes just over a year after state officials issued a notice of violation to Chemical Waste Management for illegally accepting 2.5 million pounds of radioactive waste over the span of 3 years. The company and state officials agreed to leave the waste in the landfill rather than moving it because it's safer in the ground for humans and the environment. Stay with OPB for more news throughout the day, and find news anytime online at